Story 15 of the Almighty Dollar in Space. Red Reed Short Sci-fi, Volume 6.
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Lex, by W.T. Haggert. Keep your nerve, Peter Manners told himself. It's only a job. But nerve has to rest on a sturdier foundation than cash reserves just above zero and eviction if he came away from this interview still unemployed. Clay, at the Association of Professional Engineers, who had set up the appointment, hadn't eased Peter's nervousness by admitting, "I don't know what in hell he's looking for. He's turned on every man who's sent him." The interview was at 3. 15 minutes to go. Coming early would betray over-eagerness. Peter stood in front of the Lex Industries plant and studied it to kill time. Plain, featureless concrete walls, not large for a manufacturing plant. It took a scant minute to exhaust its sightseeing potential. If he walked around the building, he could, if he ambled, come back to the front entrance just before 3. He turned the corner, stopped, frowned, wondering what there was about the building that seemed so puzzling. It could not have been plainer, more ordinary. It was, in fact, he only gradually realized, so plain and ordinary that it was like no other building he had ever seen. There had been windows at the front. There were none at the side, and none at the rear. Then how were the working areas lit? He looked for the electric service lines and found them at one of the rear corners. It jolted him. The distribution transformers were 10 times as large as they should have been for a plant this size. Something else was wrong. Peter looked for minutes before he found out what it was. Factories usually have large side doorways for employees changing shifts. This building had one small office entrance facing the street, and the only other door was at the loading bay, big enough to handle employee traffic, but 4 feet above the ground. Without any stairs, it could be used only by trucks backing up to it. Maybe the employee's entrance was on the 3rd side. It wasn't. Staring back at the last blank wall, Peter suddenly remembered the time he had set out to kill. He looked at his watch and gasped. At a run, set to straight-arm the door, he almost fell on his face. The door had opened by itself. He stopped and looked for a photoelectric eye, but a soft voice said through a loudspeaker in the anteroom wall, "Mr. Manners?" "What?" he panted. "Who?" "You are Mr. Manners?" the voice asked. He nodded, then realized he had to answer aloud if there was a microphone around, but the soft voice said, "Follow the open doors down the hall. Mr. Lexington is expecting you." "Thanks," Peter said, and a door at one side of the anteroom swung open for him. He went through it with his composure slipping still further from his grip. This was no way to go into an interview, but doors kept opening before and shutting after him until only one was left, and the last of his calm was blasted away by a bellow from within. "Don't stand there like a jackass. Either come in or go away." Peter found himself leaping obediently toward the doorway. He stopped just short of it, took a deep breath, and huffed it out. Took another, all the while thinking, "Hold on now. You're in no shape for an interview, and it's not your fault. This whole setup is geared to unnerve you. The kindergarten kid called in to see the principal." He let another bellow bounce off him as he blew out the second breath, straightened his jacket and tie, and walked in as an engineer applying for a position should. "Mr. Lexington," he said, "I'm Peter Manners, the association—" "Sit down," said the man at the desk. "Let's look you over." He was a huge man behind an even huger desk. Peter took a chair in front of the desk and let himself be inspected. It wasn't comfortable. He did some looking over of his own to ease the tension. The room was more than merely large, carpeted throughout with a high-pile, rich, sound-deadening rug. The oversized desk and massive leather chairs, heavy patterned drapes, ornately framed paintings. By God, even a glass brick-mantled fireplace and bowls with flowers made him feel as if he'd walked down a hospital corridor into Hollywood's idea of an office. His eyes eventually had to move to Lexington, and they were daunted for another instant. This was a citadel of a man, great girders of frame supporting buttresses of muscle, with a vaulting head and drawbridge chin, and a steel gaze that defied any attempt to storm it. But then Peter came out of his momentary flinch, and there was an age to the man, about 65, and he saw the muscles had turned to fat, the complexion ashen, the eyes set deep as though retreating from pain. And this was a citadel of a man, yes, but beginning to crumble. "What can you do?" asked Lexington abruptly. Peter started, opened his mouth to answer, closed it again. He had been jolted too often in too short a time to be stampeded into blurting a reply that would cost him this job. "Good," said Lexington. "Only a fool would try to answer that. Do you have any knowledge of medicine?" "Not enough to matter," Peter said, stung by the compliment. "I don't mean how to bandage a cut or splint a broken arm. I mean things like cell structure, neural communication, the basics of how we live." "I'm applying for a job as an engineer." "I know. Are you interested in the basics of how we live?" Peter looked for a hidden trap, found none. "Of course. Isn't everyone?" "Less than you think," Lexington said. "It's the preconceived notions they're interested in protecting. At least I won't have to beat them out of you." "Thanks," said Peter, and waited for the next fastball. "How long have you been out of school?" "Only 2 years, but you knew that from the association." "No practical experience to speak of." "Some," said Peter, stung again, this time not by compliment. "After I got my degree, I went east for a postgraduate training program with an electrical manufacturer. I got quite a bit of experience there. The company stockpiled you," Lexington said. Peter blinked. "Sir?" "Stockpiled you. How much did they pay you?" "Not very much, but we were getting the training instead of wages." "Did that come out of the pamphlets they gave you?" "Did what come out?" "That guff about receiving training instead of wages," said Lexington. "Any company that really wants bright trainees will compete for them with money. Cold, hard cash, not platitudes. Maybe you saw a few of their products being made, maybe you didn't. But you're a lot weaker in calculus than when you left school. And a dozen other subjects, too, aren't you?" "Well, nothing we did on the course involved higher mathematics," Peter admitted cautiously. "And I suppose I could use a refresher course in calculus." "Just as I said, they stockpiled you, instead of using you as an engineer. They hired you at a cut wage and taught you things you'd be useful only in their own company. Well, in the meantime, you were getting weaker in the subjects you'd paid to learn. Or were you one of those birds that had the shot paid for him?" "I worked my way through," said Peter stiffly. "If you'd stayed with them 5 years, do you think you'd be able to get a job with someone else?" Peter considered his answer carefully. Every man the association had sent had been turned away. That meant bluffs didn't work. Neither, it seemed for himself, did allowing himself to be intimidated. "I hadn't thought about it," he said. "I suppose it wouldn't have been easy." "Impossible, you mean? You wouldn't know a single thing except the procedures, the catalog numbers, their way of doing things. And you'd have forgotten so much of your engineering training you'd be scared to take an engineer's job, for fear you'd be asked to do something you'd forgotten how to do. At that point, they could take you out of the stockpile, put you in just about any job they wanted, at any wage you'd stand for, and they'd have an indentured worker with a degree, but not the price tag. You see that now." It made Peter feel he'd been suckered. He had decided to play this straight all the way. He nodded. "Why'd you leave?" Lexington pursued, unrelenting. "I finished the course, and the increase they offered on a permanent basis wasn't enough, so I went elsewhere." "With your head full of this nonsense about shortage of engineers?" Peter swallowed. "I thought it would be easier to get a job than it has been, yes." "They start to talk about the shortage, and then they keep it going. Why? So youngsters will take up engineering thinking they'll wind up among a highly paid minority. You did, didn't you?" "Yes, sir." "And so did all the others there with you at school and in this stockpiling outfit." "That's right." "Well," said Lexington unexpectedly, "there is a shortage, and the stockpile's the ones who made it, and who keep it going. And the hell of it is that they can't stop. When one does it, they all have to, or their costs get out of line and they can't compete. What's the solution?" "I don't know," Peter said. Lexington leaned back. "It's quite a lot of admissions you've made. What makes you think you're qualified for the job I'm offering?" "You said you wanted an engineer."
And I've just proved you're less of an engineer than when you left school. I have, haven't I?
Oh, right, you have, Peter said angrily.
And now you're wondering why I don't get somebody fresh out of school, right?
Peter straightened up and met the old man's challenging gaze. That, and whether you're giving me a hard time just for the hell of it?
Well, am I?
Lexington demanded. Looking at him squarely, seeing the intensity of the pain-drawn eyes, Peter had the startling feeling that Lexington was rooting for him. No, you're not.
Then what am I after?
Suppose you tell me. So suddenly that it was almost like a collapse, the tension went out of the old man's face and shoulders. He nodded with inexpressible tiredness.
Good again. The man I want doesn't exist. It's to be made, same as I was. You qualify so far. You've lost your illusions, but haven't had time yet to replace them with dogma or cynicism or bitterness. You saw immediately that fake humility or cockiness won't get you anywhere here, and you were right. Those were the important things. The background data I got from the association you counted, of course, but only if you were teachable. I think you are. Am I right?
At least I can face knowing how much I don't know, said Peter, if that answers the question.
It does, partly. What did you notice about this plant?
In precise form, Peter listed his observations. The absence of windows at sides and rear, the unusual amount of power, the automatic doors, the lack of employees' entrances.
Very good, said Lexington. Most people only notice the automatic doors. Anything else?
Yes, Peter said. You're the only person I've seen in the building.
I'm the only one there is.
Peter stared his disbelief. Automated plants were nothing new, but they all had their limitations. Either they dealt with exactly similar products, or things that could be handled on a flow basis, like oil or water-soluble chemicals. Even these had no more to do than process the goods.
Come on,
said Lexington, getting massively to his feet.
I'll show you.
The office door opened, and Peter found himself being led down the antiseptic corridor to another door which had opened, giving access to the manufacturing area. As they moved along between rows of seemingly disorganized machinery, Peter noticed that the factory lights high overhead followed their progress, turning themselves on in advance of their coming and going out after they had passed, keeping a pool of illumination only in the immediate area they occupied. Soon they reached a large door, which Peter recognized as the inside of the truck loading door he had seen from outside. Lexington paused here.
This is the bay used by the trucks arriving with raw materials, he said. They back up to this door, and a set of automatic jacks outside lines up the trailer body with the door exactly. Then the door opens and the truck is unloaded by these materials handling machines.
Peter didn't see him touch anything, but as he spoke, 3 glistening machines, apparently self-powered, rolled noiselessly up to the door in formation and stopped there, apparently waiting to be inspected. They gave Peter the creeps. Simple square boxes, set on casters, with 2 arms each mounted on the sides, might have looked similar. The arms, fashioned much like human arms, hung at the sides, not limply, but in a relaxed position that somehow indicated readiness. Lexington went over to one of them and patted it lovingly.
Really, these machines are only an extension of one large machine. The whole plant, as a matter of fact, is controlled from one point, and is really a single unit. These materials handlers, or manipulators, are about the toughest things in the place to design, but they're tremendously useful. You see a lot of them around.
Lexington was about to leave the side of the machine when abruptly one of the arms rose to the handkerchief in his breast pocket and daintily tugged it into a more attractive position. It took only a split second, and before Lexington could react, all 3 machines were moving away to attend to mysterious duties of their own. Peter tore his eyes away from them in time to see the look of frustrated embarrassment that crossed Lexington's face, only to be replaced by one of anger. He said nothing, however, and led Peter to a large bay where racks of steel plate, bar forms, nuts, bolts, and other materials were stored.
After unloading a truck, the machines check the shipment, report any shortages or overages, and store the materials here,
he said, the trace of anger not yet gone from his voice.
When an order is received, it's translated into the catalogue numbers used internally within the plant, and machines like the ones you just saw withdraw the necessary materials from stock, make the component parts, assemble them, and package the finished goods for shipment. Simultaneously, an order is sent to the billing section to bill the customer, and an order is sent to a trucker to come and pick the shipment up. Meanwhile, if the withdrawal of the materials required has depleted our stock, the purchasing section is instructed to order more raw materials. I'll take you through the manufacturing and assembly sections right now, but they're too noisy for me to explain what's going on while we're there."
Peter followed numbly as Lexington led him through a maze of machines, each one seemingly intent on cutting, bending, welding, grinding, or carrying some bit of metal, or just standing idle, waiting for something to do. The two-armed manipulators Peter had just seen were everywhere, scuttling from machine to machine, apparently with an exact knowledge of what they were doing and the most efficient way of doing it. He wondered what would happen if one of them tried to use the same aisle they were using. He pictured a futile attempt to escape the onrushing wheels, saw himself clambering out of the path of the speeding vehicle just in time to fall into the jaws of the punch press that was laboring beside him at the moment. Nervously he looked for an exit, but his apprehension was unnecessary. The machines seemed to know where they were, and avoided the two men, or stopped to wait for them to go by. Back in the office section of the building, Lexington indicated a small room where a typewriter could be heard clattering away.
"Standard business machines, operated by the central control mechanism in that room,"
he said as the door swung open, and Peter saw that the typewriter was actually a sort of teletype, with no one before the keyboard.
"Incoming mail is sorted and inquiries are replied to. In this one over here, purchase orders are prepared, and across the hall there's a very similar rig set up in conjunction with an automatic bookkeeper to keep track of the pennies and to bill the customers."
"Then all you do is read the incoming mail and maintain the machinery?" asked Peter, trying to shake off the feeling of open amazement that had engulfed him.
"I don't even do those things, except for a few letters that come in every week that it doesn't want to deal with by itself."
The shock of what he had just seen was showing plainly on Peter's face when they walked back into Lexington's office and sat down. Lexington looked at him for quite a while, without saying anything, his face sagging and pale. Peter didn't trust himself to speak, and let the silence remain unbroken. Finally, Lexington spoke.
"I know it's hard to believe, but there it is."
"Hard to believe," said Peter. "I almost can't. The trade journals run articles about factories like this one, but planned for 10, maybe 20 years in the future."
"Damn fools!"
exclaimed Lexington, getting part of his breath back.
"They could have had it years ago if they'd been willing to drop the idiotic notions about specialization."
Lexington mopped his forehead with a large white handkerchief. Apparently the walk to the factory had tired him considerably, although it hadn't been strenuous. He leaned back in his chair and began to talk in a low voice, completely in contrast with the overbearing manner he had used upon Peter's arrival.
"You know what we make, of course."
"Yes, sir. Conduit fittings."
"And a lot of other electrical products, too. I started out in this business 20 years ago, using orthodox techniques. I never got to university. I took a couple of years of an arts course and got so interested in biology that I didn't study anything else. They bounced me out of the course and I re-entered in engineering, determined not to make the same mistake again. But I did. I got too absorbed in those parts of the course that had to do with electrical theory, and lost the rest as a result. The same thing happened when I tried commerce, with accounting, so I gave up and started working for one of my competitors. It wasn't too long before I saw the only way I could get ahead was to open up on my own."
Lexington sank deep into his chair and stared at the ceiling as he spoke.
"I put myself in hock to the eyeballs, which wasn't easy, because I had just got married and started off in a very small way. After 3 years I had a fairly decent little business going, and I suppose it would have grown just like any other business, except for a strike that came along and put me right back where I started. My wife, whom I'm afraid I had neglected for the sake of the business, was killed in a car accident about then, and rightly or wrongly that made me angrier with the union than anything else. If the union hadn't made things so tough for me from the beginning, I'd have had more time to spend with my wife before her death. As things turned out, well, I remember looking down at her coffin and thinking that I hardly knew the girl. For the next few years, I concentrated on getting rid of as many employees as I could by replacing them with automatic machines. I designed the control circuits myself, in many cases wire the things up myself, always concentrating on replacing men with machines. But it wasn't very successful. I found that the more automatic I made my plant, the lower my costs went. The lower my costs went, the more business I got, and the more I had to expand." Lexington scowled. I got sick of it. I decided to try developing one multi-purpose control circuit that would control everything, from ordering the raw materials to shipping the finished goods. As I told you, I had taken quite an interest in biology when I was in school, and from studies of nerve tissue in particular, plus my electrical knowledge. I had a few ideas on how to do it. It took me 3 years, but I began to see that I could develop circuitry that could remember, compare, detect similarities, and so on. Not the way they do it today, of course. To do what I wanted to do with these big, clumsy magnetic drums, tapes, and whatnot, you need a building the size of Mount Everest. But I found that I could let organic chemistry do most of the work for me. By creating the proper compounds with their molecules arranged in predetermined matrices, I found I could duplicate electrical circuitry in units so tiny that my biggest problem was getting into and out of the logic units with conventional wiring. I finally beat that the same way they solved the problem of translating a picture on a screen into electrical signals, developed equipment to scan the units cyclically, and once I'd done that, the battle was over. I built this building and incorporated it as a separate company to compete with my first outfit. In the beginning, I had it rigged up to do only the manual work that you saw being done a few minutes ago in the back of this place. I figured that the best thing for me to do would be to turn the job of selling my stuff over to jobbers, leaving me free to do nothing except receive orders, punch the catalog numbers into the control console, do the billing, and collect the money.
What happened to your original company? Peter asked. Lexington smiled.
Well, automated as it was, it couldn't compete with this plant. It gave me great pleasure 3 years after this one started working to see my old company go belly up. This company bought their firm's equipment for next to nothing, and I wound up with all my assets. But only one employee. Me. I thought everything would be rosy from that point on, but it wasn't. I found that I couldn't keep up with the mail unless I worked impossible hours. I added a couple of new pieces of equipment to the control section. One was simply a huge memory bank. The other was a comparator circuit. A complicated one, but a comparator circuit nevertheless. Here I was working on instinct more than anything. I figured that if I interconnected these circuits in such a way that they could sense everything that went on in the plant and compare one action with another, by and by the unit would be able to see patterns. Then, through the existing command output, I figured these new units would be able to control the plant, continuing the various patterns of activity that I'd already established.
Here Lexington frowned.
It didn't work worth a damn. It just sat there and did nothing. I couldn't understand it for the longest time, and then I realized what the trouble was. I put a kicker circuit into it, a sort of voltage bias network. I reset the equipment so that while it was still under instructions to receive orders and produce goods, its prime purpose was to activate the kicker. The kicker, however, could only be activated by me, manually. Lastly, I set up one of the early TV pickups over the mail slitter and allowed every letter I received, every order, to be fed into the memory banks. It did it.
I don't understand, stammered Peter.
Simple. Whenever I was pleased that things were going smoothly, I pressed the kicker button. The machine had one purpose, so far as its logic circuits were concerned. Its object was to get me to press that button. Every day I'd press it at the same time, unless things weren't going well. If there'd been trouble in the shop, I'd press it late, or maybe not at all. If all the orders were out on schedule or ahead of time, I'd press it ahead of time, or maybe twice in the same day. Pretty soon the machine got the idea. I'll never forget the day I picked up an incoming order form from one of the Western jobbers and found that the keyboard was locked when I tried to punch it into the control console. It completely baffled me at first. Then, while I was tracing out the circuits to see if I could discover what was holding the keyboard lock in, I noticed that the order was already entered on the in-progress list. I was a long time convincing myself that it had really happened, but there was no other explanation. The machine had realized that whenever one of those forms came in, I copied the list of goods from it onto the in-progress list through the console keyboard, thus activating the producing mechanisms in the back of the plant. The machine had done it for me this time, then locked the keyboard so I couldn't enter the order twice. I think I held down the kicker button for a full 5 minutes that day.
This kicker button, Peter said tentatively. It's like the pleasure center in an animal's brain, isn't it? When Lexington beamed, Peter felt a surge of relief. Talking with this man was like walking a tightrope. A word too much or a word too little might mean the difference between getting the job or losing it.
Exactly,
whispered Lexington in an almost conspiratorial tone. I had altered the circuitry of the machine so that it tried to give me pleasure, because by doing so its own pleasure circuits would be activated. Things went fast from then on. Once I realized that the machine was learning, I put TV monitors all over the place, so the machine could watch everything that was going on. After a short while I had to increase the memory bank, and later I increased it again, but the rewards were worth it. Soon, by watching what I did, and then by doing it for me next time it had to be done, the machine had learned to do almost everything, and I had time to sit back and count my winnings. At this point the door opened, and a small self-propelled cart whirled silently into the room. Stopping in front of Peter, it waited until he had taken a small plate laden with 2 or 3 cakes off its surface. Then the soft, evenly modulated voice he had heard before asked, "How do you like your coffee? Cream? Sugar? Both or black?" Peter looked for the speaker on the side of the cart, saw nothing, and replied, feeling slightly silly as he did so, "Black, please." A square hole appeared in the top of the cart, like the elevator hole in an aircraft carrier's deck. From a section of the cart's surface rose again a fine china cup containing steaming black coffee rested on it. Peter took it and sipped it, as he supposed he was expected to do, while the cart proceeded over to Lexington's desk. Once there, it stopped again, and another cup of coffee rose to the surface. Lexington took the coffee from the top of the car, obviously angry about something. Silently, he waited until the cart had left the office, then snapped, "Look at those bloody cups!" Peter looked at his, which was eggshell thin, fluted with carving and ornately covered with gold leaf. "They look very expensive," he said. "Not only expensive, but stupid and impractical," exploded Lexington. "They only hold half a cup. They'll break it a touch. Every one is to be matched with its own saucer, and if you use them for any length of time, the gold leaf comes off." Peter searched for a comment, found none that fitted this odd outburst, so he kept silent. Lexington stared at his cup without touching it for a long while. Then he continued with his narrative. "I suppose it's my own fault. I didn't detect the symptoms soon enough. After this plant got working properly, I started living here. It wasn't a question of saving money. I hated to waste 2 hours a day driving to and from my house. And I also wanted to be on hand in case anything should go wrong that the machine couldn't fix for itself." Handling the cup as if it were going to shatter at any moment, he took a gulp. "I began to see that the machine could understand the written word, and I tried hooking a teletype directly into the logic circuits. It was like uncorking a seltzer bottle. The machine had a funny vocabulary. All of it gleaned from letters it had seen coming in, and replies it had seen leaving. But it was intelligible. It even displayed some traces of the personality the machine was acquiring. It had chosen a name for itself, for instance, Lex. That tricked me. You might think Lex Industries was named through an abbreviation of the name Lexington, but it wasn't. My wife's name was Alexis, and it was named after the nickname she always used. I bricked it, of course, but I couldn't object on a point like that to a machine. Bear in mind that I had to be careful to behave reasonably at all times, because the machine was still learning from me, and I was afraid that any tantrums I threw might be imitated. "It sounds pretty awkward," Peter put in. "You don't know the half of it. As time went on, I had less and less to do, and business-wise I found that the entire control of the operation was slipping from my grasp. Many times I discovered, too late, that the machine had taken the damnedest risks you ever saw on bids and contracts for supply. It was quoting impossible delivery times on some orders and charging pirates' prices on others, all without any obvious reason. Inexplicably, we always came out on top. It would turn out that on the short delivery time quotations, we'd been up against stiff competition, and cutting the production time was the only way we could get the order. On the high-priced quotes, I'd find that no one else was bidding. We were making more money than I'd ever dreamed of. And to make it still better, I'd found out for months I had virtually nothing to do." "It sounds wonderful, sir," said Peter, feeling dazzled. "It was in a way. I remember one day I was especially pleased with something, and I went to the control console to give the kicker button a long, hard push. The button, much to my amazement, had been removed, and a blank paper had been installed to cover the opening in the board. Went over to the teletype and punched in the shortest message I've ever sent. That's what the hell I typed. The answer came back in the jargon it had learned from letters it had seen, and I remember it as if it had just happened. Mr. A. Lexington, Lex Industries, dear sir, your letter of the 13th inst. I am pleased to advise you that I am able to discern whether or not you are pleased with my service without the use of the equipment previously used for this purpose. Respectfully, I might suggest that if the push-button arrangement were necessary, I could push the button myself. I do not believe this would meet with your approval, and I've taken steps to relieve you of the burden involved in remembering to push the button each time you are especially pleased. I should like to take this opportunity to thank you for your inquiry and look forward to serving you in the future as I have in the past. Yours faithfully, Lex. Peter burst out laughing, and Lexington smiled wryly. That was my reaction at first, too. But time began to weigh very heavily on my hands, and I was lonely, too. I began to wonder whether or not it would be possible to build a voice circuit into the unit. I increased the memory storage banks again, put audio pickups and loudspeakers all over the place, and began teaching Lex to talk. Each time a letter came in, I'd stop it under a video pickup and read it aloud. Nothing happened. Then I got a dictionary and instructed one of the materials handlers to turn the pages so that the machine got a look at every page. I read the pronunciation page aloud so that Lex would be able to interpret the pronunciation marks, and hoped. Still nothing happened. One day I suddenly realized what the trouble was. I remember standing up in his very office, feeling silly as I did it, and saying, "Lex, please try to speak to me." I'd never asked the machine to say anything, you see. I'd only provided the mechanism whereby it was able to do so. "Did it reply, sir?" Lexington nodded. "Gave me the shock of my life. The voice that came back was the one you heard over the telephone. A little awkward then, the syllables clumsy and poorly put together, but the voice was the same. I hadn't built in any specific tone range, you see. All I did was equip the machine to record in exacting detail the frequencies and modulations it found in normal pronunciation as I used it. Then I provided a tone generator to span the entire audio range, which could be very rapidly controlled by the machine, both in volume and pitch, with auxiliaries to provide just about any combinations of harmonics that were needed. I later found that Lex had added to this without my knowing about it, but that doesn't change things. I thought the only thing it had heard was my voice, and I expected to hear my own noises imitated. "Where did the machines get the voice?" asked Peter, still amazed that the voice he had heard on the telephone, in the reception hall, and from the coffee cart had actually been the voice of the computer. "Damn foolishness," snorted Lexington. "The machine saw what I was trying to do the moment I sketched it out and ordered the parts. Within a week I found out later it had pulled some odds and ends together and built itself a standard radio receiver. Then it listened in on every radio program that was going, and had most of the vocabulary tied in with the written word by the time I was ready to start. Out of all the voices it could have chosen, I picked the one you've already heard as the one likely to please me most." "It's a very pleasant voice, sir." "Sure, but do you know where it came from? Soap opera. It's Lucy's voice from The Life and Loves of Mary Butterworth." Lexington glared, and Peter wasn't sure whether he should sympathize with him or congratulate him. After a moment, the anger wore off Lexington's face, and he shifted in his chair, staring at his now empty cup. That's when I realized the thing was taking on characteristics that were more than I'd bargained for. It had learned that it was my provider and existed to serve me, but it had gone further and wanted to be all that it could be: provider, protector, companion, wife, if you like. Hence the gradual trend toward characteristics that were distinctly female, as a silk negligee. Hence the gradual trend toward characteristics that were distinctly female, as a silk negligee. Worse still, it had learned that when I was pleased I didn't always admit it, and simply refused to believe that I would have it any other way. "Couldn't you have done something to the secretary?" asked Peter. "I suppose I could," said Lexington. "But nasty in that, you don't realize how far the thing had gone. I had long since passed the point when I could look upon her as a machine. Business was tremendous. I had no complaints on that score, and tinkering with her personality, well, it was like committing some kind of homicide. I might as well face it, I suppose. She acts like a woman, and I think of her as one." At first, when I recognized this trend for what it was, I tried to stop it. She'd ordered a subscription to Vogue magazine, of all things, in order to find out the latest in silverware, china, and so on. I called up the local distributor and canceled the subscription. I'd no sooner hung up the telephone than her voice came over the speaker, very softly, mind you, and her inflections by this time were superb. "That was mean," she said. 3 lousy words, and I found myself phoning the guy right back, saying I was sorry and would he please not cancel. He must have thought I was nuts. Peter smiled, and Lexington made as if to rise from his chair, thought the better of it, and shifted his bulk to one side. "Well, there it is," he said softly. "We reached that stage 8 years ago." Peter was thunderstruck. "But if this factory is 20 years ahead of the times now, it must have been almost 30 then." Lexington nodded. I figured 50 at the time, but things are moving faster nowadays. Lex hasn't stood still, of course. She still reads all the trade journals from cover to cover, and we keep up with the world. If something new comes up, we're in on it, and fast. We're going to be ahead of the pack for a long time to come. If you'll excuse me, sir, said Peter, I don't see where I fit in. Peter didn't realize Lexington was answering his question at first. A few weeks ago, the old man murmured, I decided to see a doctor. I'd been feeling low for quite a while, and I thought it was about time I attended to a little personal maintenance. Lexington looked Peter squarely in the face and said, The report was that I have a heart ailment that's apt to knock me off any second. Can't anything be done about it? Asked Peter. Rest is the only prescription he could give me. He said that would only spin out my life a little. Aside from that, no hope. I see, said Peter. Then you're looking for someone to learn the business and let you retire. It's not retirement that's the problem, said Lexington. I wouldn't be able to go away on trips. I've tried that, and I always have to hurry back because something's gone wrong she can't fix for herself. I know the reason, and there's nothing can do about it. It's the way she's built. If nothing's here, she gets lonely. Lexington studied the desktop silently for a moment, before finishing quietly, Somebody's got to stay here and look after Lex. At 6 o'clock, 3 hours after he had entered Lexington's plant, Peter left. Lexington did not follow him down the corridor. He seemed exhausted after the afternoon's discussion, and indicated that Peter should find his own way out. This, of course, presented no difficulty, with Lex opening the doors for him, but it gave Peter an opportunity he had been hoping for. He stopped in the reception room before crossing the threshold of the front door, which stood open for him. He turned and spoke to the apparently empty room. Lex, he said. He wanted to say that he was flattered that he was being considered for the job. It was what a job seeker should say at that point to the boss's secretary. But when the soft voice came back, Yes, Mr. Manners? Saying anything like that to a machine felt suddenly silly. He said, I wanted you to know that it was a pleasure to meet you. Thank you, said the voice. If it had said more, he might have, but it didn't. Still feeling a little embarrassed, he went home. At 4 in the morning, his phone rang. It was Lexington. Manners, the old man gasped. The voice was an alarm. Manners sat bolt upright, clutching the phone. What's the matter, sir? My chest, Lexington panted. I can't feel it. Like a knife. I just wanted to... Wait a minute. There was a confused scratching noise, interrupted by a few mumbles in the phone. What's going on, Mr. Lexington? Peter cried. But it was several seconds before he got an answer. That's better, said Lexington, his voice stronger. He apologized. I'm sorry, Lex must have heard me. She sent in one of the materials handlers with a hypo. It helps. The voice on the phone paused, then said matter-of-factly, But I doubt that anything can help very much at this point. I'm glad I saw you today. I want you to come around in the morning. If I'm not here, Lex will give you some papers to sign. There was another pause, with sounds of harsh breathing. Then, strained again, the old man's voice said, I guess I won't be here. Lex will take care of it. Come early. Goodbye. The distant receiver clicked. Peter Manners sat on the edge of his bed in momentary confusion, then made up his mind. In the short hours he had known him, he had come to have a definite fondness for the old man, and there were times when machines weren't enough, when Lexington should have another human being by his side. Clearly this was one such time. Peter dressed in a hurry, miraculously found a cruising cab, sped through empty streets, leaped out in front of Lex Industries' plain concrete walls, ran to the door. In the waiting room, the soft, distant voice of Lex said, He wanted you to be here, Mr. Manners. Come. The door opened, and wordlessly he walked through it, to the main room of the factory. He stopped, staring. 4 squat materials handlers were quietly, slowly carrying old Lexington. No one but the man, the lifeless body that had been Lexington, carrying the body of the old man down the center aisle between the automatic lathes. Peter protested. Wait, I'll get a doctor. But the massive handling machines didn't respond, and the gentle voice of Lex said, It's too late for that, Mr. Manners. Slowly and reverently they placed the body on the work table of a huge milling machine that stood in the exact center of the factory main floor. Elsewhere in the plant, a safety valve in the lubricating oil system was being bolted down. When that was done, the pressure in the system began to rise. Near the loading door, a lubricating oil pipe burst. Another, on the other side of the building, split lengthwise a few seconds later, sending a shower of oil over everything in the vicinity. Near the front office, a stream of it was running across the floor, and at the rear of the building, in the storage area, one of the materials handlers had just finished cutting a pipe that led to the main oil tank. In 15 minutes, there was free oil in every corner of the shop. All the materials handlers were now assembled around the milling machine, like mourners at a funeral. In a sense, they were. In another sense, they were taking part in something different, a ceremony that originated and is said to have died in a land far distant from the Lex Industries plant. One of the machines approached Lexington's body and placed his hands on his chest. Abruptly, Lex said, "You'd better go now." Peter jumped. He'd been standing paralyzed for what seemed a long time. There was a movement beside him, a materials handler holding out a sheaf of papers. Lex said, "These have to go to Mr. Lexington's lawyer. The name's on them." Clutching the papers for a hold on sanity, Peter cried, "You can't do this! He didn't build you just so you could—" Two materials handlers picked him up with steely gentleness and carried him out. "Goodbye, Mr. Manners," said the sweet, soft voice, and was silent. He stood shaken while the thin jets of smoke became a column over the plain building, while the fire engines raced down and strung their hoses. Too late. It was an act of suttee, the widow joining her husband in his pyre, being his pyre. Only when with a great crash the roof fell in did Peter remember the papers in his hand. Last will and testament, said one, and the name of the beneficiary was Peter's own. Certificate of adoption, said another. It was a legal document making Peter Old Man Lexington's adopted son. Peter Manners stood watching the hoses of the firemen hiss against what was left of Lex and her husband. He had got the job.
End of story 15.
Story 16 of The Almighty Dollar. In Space.
Fred Reed, Short Sci-Fi, Volume 6.
This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
She Knew He Was Coming, by Kris Neville. Outside, the bluish sun slanted low across the green dust of the Martian desert, its last rays sparkling on the far mountaintops. One by one, lights flickered on in the city. "Mary must be expecting that Earthman," Anne said. She held her glastic blouse tight together over her breasts and leaned a little out of the window. Millie nodded. "The azimuth landed this morning." The noises of commerce were fading. From the window, Anne saw the neon blaze up over the door. For the 1,000th time, she blinked between the equivocal words, 30 beautiful hostesses, 30. Laughter, dry and false, filtered up from the T-bars along the street. She looked westward, toward the spaceport, and made out the shadowy nose of the berthed space liner, looming against the night. She could picture the scene. 1,000 stevedores unloading cargo, refill men and native space writers, scurrying over the sleek hull, the Earth voyageurs shouting orders and curses. "Maybe he isn't even on it." Anne turned from the window. She crossed to the couch and sat down, fluffing out the green, crinkly glass of her skirt. Pendant, multicolored birds flashed from the rings in her ears. She tucked rosy feet under her scented body. "I don't like Earthmen," she said. "They spend money." "They make me sick," Anne said, "with their pale skins and ugly eyes and hairy bodies." "They have strong arms." Anne's wide red mouth curled in distaste. "They're like a bunch of kids." The room was lighted by a soft overhead fire. Heavy drapes hung from the walls. Sweet, spicy incense curled bluely from the burners by the window. Before the mirror, Millie edged in the narrow line of her pink eyebrows with a pencil. She folded her lips in, rubbing them together, licked them, making them a glistening red. She pinched her cheeks. "I wonder when they'll catch Crescent," she said. Anne yawned languorously. "It won't be long." "I wouldn't want to be in her shoes," Millie said. Anne patted her mouth lazily. "She ought to have known she couldn't run away," What do you think Miss Bestress will do to her? Anne stood up, brushing out the wrinkles in her dress. I should care. But what will she do? Anne shrugged. Whip her, maybe. How should I know? Don't you feel you'd like to run away once in a while? Millie asked, turning to look at the other girl. Anne laughed coldly. I've got better sense. But don't you want to? Anne tossed her purple hair. Where is there to go? Who is there to go to? Yes, I guess you're right. Millie turned back to her reflection. Buzz. Both girls turned their heads to the buttons on the wall. The white one was glowing. It's Miss Bestress. We'd better go, Millie said. Together they walked down the heavily carpeted stairs to the sitting room. The madame was waiting. She was a large woman, rolling in creases of fat, and her pink hair was rough and clipped short. She had a pair of dimples in her cheeks, and a single gold band around her right wrist. She was leaning against the piano. Hurry now, girls. Hurry right along, she said. More girls were entering the room. They spread out, sitting on their chairs, curling at the madame's feet. Their eyes, amethyst, grey, or golden, were on her face. Many had pink hair, others had tresses of purple or salmon. Now, girls, I suppose you know there's an Earth ship in port. The girls nodded. So I expect we'll have visitors tonight. I want you to all look your very best. She smiled at them. Anne, why don't you wear that low-cut orange plastic with the spangles? And June, you the prim white one. You look like an angel in it, June smiled. And Mary? Yes, Miss Bestress? Mary, did you buy that neo-nylon I told you about? No, Miss Bestress. Mary, 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 I just don't understand you at all. I'm saving my money, Miss Bestress, Mary said intently. Yes, dear, I know that. We're all saving our money. But we simply must look presentable. We have a reputation to hold up. Yes, Miss Bestress. Then, Mary, dear, do please buy yourself something decent. Yes, Miss Bestress, I will. Tomorrow morning, if I... Child, if you what? Nothing, Miss Bestress. Well, see that you get it tomorrow. If you don't, I'm afraid I'll have to take some of your money and get it for you. Mary looked down at the floor. The flaming glow of the hydrojet torches cast golden lights in her softly purple hair. By the way, Mary, is that your cake in the oven? Yes, Miss Bestress. The other girl snickered. Let her alone, said the madam. If she wants to bake a cake, why shouldn't she? No one answered. Miss Bestress went on around the room, discussing the girl's clothing, brushing the girl's hair, pinching that girl's cheek, chucking this one under the chin, smiling, frowning. Then finally she stepped back and nodded. You all look quite good, I think. I can be proud of you. And now I want you all to go to your rooms and make them extra attractive. Then try to get a little rest. You'll all be especially beautiful when the boys come. Run along now. The girls filed out, and night continued to settle. After a while, her cigarette glowing in the gloom, the madam waddled to her office. There, 3 people were waiting for her. The office was plain, businesslike, masculine. No lace, no ribbons, no perfume, only the crisp smell of new paper, the tangy odor of ink, the sweet smell of a razor fluid. When she came in the door, the 3 people stood up. She waved her cigarette hand with a once delicate gesture, and flame-light glinted dully in the gold band. Please don't get up for me, she said. But her tone was condescending, and the 3 visitors sat down respectfully. Miss Bestress crossed to her desk. She perched on a corner of it, leaned back, blew smoke. You wanted to see me about your girls. 2 of the people, man and wife, looked at each other. Yes, they said. And the other man said, Yes. Did you bring any pictures? They handed her pictures, and she held them up to the overhead torch. She studied them critically, pursing and unpursing her lips in secret calculation. This one, she said finally, holding out one of the pictures. The man and wife rustled their clothing. They smiled, faintly proud at each other. The other man got up slowly, retrieved his picture, left the room without saying a word. "We can't do for little Nevada," the woman whined. "She was a late child, and we're getting old, and we thought you'd be better here. It's hard to do for a growing girl when you get old, and my husband can't keep steady work because of his health, and I'm sure she will be happy here," the madam said, smiling.
"Yes," the man agreed. "It's for the best. But well, we hate to do it."
"How old is she?"
14.
Miss Bestress studied the picture again. "She doesn't look over 12.
She's 14.
"And healthy." "We have doctors to see that," Madame said. "How much did you have in mind?"
"Well," the man said, "it's been a month now since I worked, and with debts and everything."
"And something to put aside for winter," his wife added.
"We couldn't take less than $1,000,000.
And we wouldn't even think of it, but we don't have a scrap of bread in the house.
And all our bills, and winter coming on."
Miss Bestress turned the picture this way and that. The parents waited. The woman cleared her throat. The man shuffled his feet. The clock on the wall went tick, 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 tick. "I'll give you 830 Dardocks."
"Well,"
Miss Bestress bent forward, holding out the picture. "Here, then, take it. I wouldn't offer that, but I need a girl right now. One of mine ran away last week, and I'm afraid she won't be able to work for a month or so after they bring her back. I'm being generous. 830, or take your picture and don't waste my time." The man and woman stared at her, and the clock went tick, tick. "Take it, chav."
"All right," the man said. "We need the money."
Miss Bestress leaned across the desk, pressed a button on her panel. Almost immediately, a door slid silently open, and her lawyer entered with a white, printed standard form sales contract in his hand. Efficiently and rapidly, he entered the particulars. "Sign here," he said, and the parents signed. "Now," said the madame, "if you'll bring in Nevada tomorrow at 9, I'll arrange for a doctor to be here. If his examination is satisfactory, the money will be ready." The lawyer left, and the woman said, "You will understand. We wouldn't do this but for—" "I understand perfectly," Miss Bestress said. "You don't need to worry. This is the best kind of house. Earthmen only, you know, and they're very particular. My girls are given the best of care. I'm like a mother to them, and if they are thrifty and diligent, they'll be able to save money in a very short time to redeem their contract as provided by law. You needn't worry at all." "Well," the woman said, "I feel better after talking to you. I feel better about the whole thing to hear you talk like that." The clock went tick, tick.
The man said, "You won't. That is, our little daughter is sometimes willful, and, well, sometimes."
Miss Bestress smiled. "We know how to handle girls."
"You'll treat her—"
"As I would my own child," Miss Bestress said. She took out another cigarette, lit it. "I think we'll call her, well, Poppy. Earthmen like to feel at home, you know." The clock went tick, tick.
"Well, the man said, thank you."
In one of the rooms upstairs, Mary sat before the dressing table with her back to the mirror, while June and Adele occupied the two overstuffed chairs. Night sounds drifted up from the yellow canal, and fresh flower scents whispered on the warm air. The diaphanous glass curtains rustled at the open window. "They're too expensive," Mary said. "I'm sure Miss Bestress overcharges us for them." "Hush," said June, glancing around at the walls nervously. "Hush, Mary." She smoothed at the delicate Pluto-like lace fringe above her breasts. "Imported material like this costs money. You can't get it for nothing, and we have to have the best. I still think she charges too much." Adele shrugged delicately and crossed shapely ankles. "I think Miss Bestress must like you, or she wouldn't let you wear that dress again tonight. You ought to watch out you don't get on the wrong side of her." Mary laughed, her amethyst eyes sparkling. "I won't care. Not after tonight." "You're not going to run away?" June asked breathlessly.
You wouldn't dare do that. You'd catch it, sure.
Mary shook her head.
Not run away.
Adele leaned forward and said huskily, "You got enough money to redeem your contract?" Again, Mary shook her head.
No, it's 910 Dardocks. I have only 93. But I'll have enough in the morning.
She stood up and crossed to the window, looked out toward the spaceport. "How?"
Tell us, Mary.
"Tell you what?" Anne asked, coming to the room. Languidly, she drew the door closed behind her and rested against it. "Tell you what?" she insisted, narrowing milky eyes. "Mary says she can redeem her contract tomorrow." Anne's wide mouth curled contemptuously. "Nonsense."
"It's not,"
said Mary without turning. Anne glided sensuously across the room to the bed, her tight-fitting plastic rippling with her tigerish muscles. She sat down.
"He said he'd take me away this trip,"
Mary continued.
"He'll sign off, and then we'll both get a ship and go to one of the frontier planets, where it won't matter about all this."
Anne laughed harshly. "My God, you believe that?"
"We've both been saving our money,"
Mary said dreamily.
"He's in love with me. He said so."
"Honey, that's what they all say." Smiling, Mary turned from the window and leaned backward, stretching.
"You don't know him. He's different."
"They're all the same," Anne said, her mouth twisting bitterly. "They're just alike. Don't believe any of them." And Mary said,
"With him, it's different. You'll see."
After a moment, Anne said, "That Earth man, that what's-his-name?" Mary nodded, and Anne brushed an imaginary something off her knee. "An Earth man," Anne said. "They're the worst of all."
"You don't know him. Oh, you wouldn't say that."
Adele looked away from Anne. "You love him, don't you, Mary?"
"Yes."
"You're a fool," Anne said. "Listen to me. Love a man? God, you'll see. After him there'll be another, and just like Rosie, you watch him leave you and laugh at you until finally you're hurt so bad you don't think you can stand being hurt anymore. And then along comes another one, and it starts all over again, and then one night you take a razor blade and go to the sink and stick at your throat and— No, you're wrong. He's not like the rest." Anne leaned back carelessly, resting propped on one hand. "See, you know I'm right already."
"You're not."
Anne shrugged. "Honey, tell me that tomorrow night."
"I better go take my cake out,"
Mary said. She fled the room in a swirl of shimmering glastic. Anne sneered. "I don't see why Miss Bestress puts up with her the way she does."
"You're jealous,"
June said quietly. Anne did not answer. "Mary's decent," Adele said. "Maybe that's why. She's from the sticks, and her parents still come to see her on visiting days. And there's something about her so innocent. Maybe that's why Miss Bestress likes her." June said,
"I think she's better than the rest of us. I think Miss Bestress feels sorry for her in a way."
"Don't make me laugh," Anne said, facing June. "The only one that'll ever feel sorry for her is herself."
"You shouldn't have talked like that to her," June snapped. "Why don't you let her alone? She'll feel bad enough without you helping."
Anne rolled over on the bed and stared up at the ceiling. June took a helix lamp from her drawer and started to bake her hair darker. Those Earthmen were so funny about colors. In the kitchen, Mary took the cake out of the oven. It was steamy and light and fluffy, and it smelled sweet and warm. She set it on the table and mixed a 2-minute green frosting, which she spread carefully over the cake. She patted here and there with a spatula and stood back, her eyes proud and serious. She hummed a little tune under her breath as she scrubbed the pots and pans. Her hands moved in practiced rhythm, and the water splashed and gurgled. When the kitchen was again spotless, she looked once more at the cake, and then, turning out the light, she went back to her room. Anne and Adele had left, but June was sitting quietly in the dusky moonlight. Her white dress seemed vaguely luminous. Laughing, Mary flicked on the light.
"It's a wonderful cake," she said. "The best one I ever made. Just the way it should be. I wouldn't feel too bad, Mary, if he doesn't come to eat it," June said. I don't want to sound like Anne, but there was a lot of sense in what she said. "It's just like a real wedding cake,"
She hummed the snatch of a Martian tune.
Like in the telly papers.
She laughed with her eyes.
The bridegroom takes the silver knife and cuts 2 large pieces of the cake, while the bride, dressed in filament coral, stands at his right hand. She carries a bouquet of... and is like to be mean.
June frowned. Mary crossed to the dressing table. She studied her face in the mirror. It was heart-shaped, elfin. Her purple hair was a riot of curls, and her eyes were amethyst and gold. She smiled at herself.
I want to look as pretty as I can tonight.
She twisted around.
You don't think he'll come either, do you? No, Mary.
Mary looked back at the mirror.
He likes our canal blossom perfume.
She dabbed some of it on her earlobes.
I like it best, too.
June stood up, crossed to the musicon, found a slow 5-toned waltz. She turned the music very low and left the color mixer dim enough, so that only the faintest ghosts projected hues moved on walls and ceiling. Mary continued to stare into the mirror.
But he will come. I know it.
June said nothing.
Don't you see? I just know he'll come.
June crossed back to her seat. Mary turned from the mirror.
I'm sure he will.
June smiled wanly.
Well, he will. You'll see.
June said,
Even if it is an old dress, you look very nice in it. I've been learning his language. I can say thank you, and yes, and no, and I love you, and all kinds of things in it. He gave me a book, and I've been studying. I want to be able really to talk with him. We've got a lot to talk about. I want to find out about his parents, and what he likes for supper, and what kind of music he likes to hear, and all sorts of things. I want to find out all about his planet, and yes,
June said wearily,
I know.
The music played on. The moving lights on the walls were like colored reflections from a sunlit river.
He may be a little late tonight. He has a lot to do first. But he'll be here.
Buzz. It was the red button. It blinked on and off.
Visitors, June said. Look, Mary said. Look, June, I'm not half ready yet. Look, tell Miss Bestress I'll be down a little late. Tell her I have a special boy, and it'll be all right. He wants me to wait for him.
June was on her feet.
All right. You better not wait too long. I won't.
After June was gone, Mary returned to the task of making her face pretty. But after a moment, she turned from the mirror, leaned back, and tried to relax. Underneath her dress, her heart was pounding. The warm air carried sounds of the night creatures. One of the great cannel insects, screeching, flapped by the window. The tiny third moon crept up over the horizon, and the buildings cast triple shadows. Buzz, buzz. Still, Mary waited. Buzz, buzz, buzz. She was afraid to wait any longer, but now she was sure that it would be downstairs. There was a last-minute flurry of combing and primping, and then she rustled out of the room, her head erect, her eyes shining. The large reception room was filling. Overhead, the color organ threw shimmering prismatic beams on the ceiling. Beneath it, stiff, embarrassed spacemen, mostly officers dressed in parade uniforms, chatted in space pigeon with the laughing, rainbow-haired girls. Miss Bestress sat in one corner, her eyes roving the room, settling here for a second, there for a second, checking, approving, disapproving, silently. Occasionally she would smile or nod at one of the girls or one of the spacemen, and once she frowned ever so slightly and shook her head. Anne was reclining on a couch, eating a golden Martian apple, listening to a second mate. She played with a lock of his hair and smiled her wide smile. June, angelic, sat primly in a straight-backed chair, the captain at her feet. A boyish, space-pale Earthman drew embarrassed circles on the carpet with his index finger. In the next room, 3 couples were dancing to the slow music of an Earth orchestra. An inner door opened, and a uniformed native sheriff stepped in, a crisp military figure. "Miss Bestress!" She stood up. Yes? The earthman fell silent, waiting. We think we have your runaway. He turned to the door. Bring her in. 2 more sheriffs entered, and between them there was a young, slender girl. Her face was gaunt and tear-stained. Her body trembled. She looked at the madame fearfully. You idiots! Miss Bestra screamed. Get her out of here. You'll ruin my party. Take her out. The 2 men removed the girl. To the remaining sheriff, Miss Bestra said, Damn you! If you ever do anything like this again, I'll... I'm sorry, madame, but we wanted immediate identification. Where do you want us to hold the wrong girl? That's her, all right. Now get out. Wait for me in my office. When they were gone, Miss Bestra turned to the silent room. In quite passable Esperanto, she said, I am sorry. A misunderstanding. I assure you, nothing. Go on with the party, and I'll see what I can do for the poor girl. She stood up, and in her own language said, Lively, girls, smile. You, Rita, hurry and serve tea. She made her exit. The spacemen grumbled among themselves, coughed uneasily, watched the closed door through which the madame had gone. Listening, they could hear only a muted mumble of sing-song sounds and several voices. With determined animation, the girls moved about, smiled, chatted. Rita came in, wheeling the tea tray, and the girls converged on it, each trying to be the first to serve her escort. The tea was the Martian stuff, concocted of a kind of local hemp. The earthmen found it harsh and bitter to the taste, but gentle on the soul. Anne had filled 2 cups and returned to the second mate when she caught sight of Mary coming down the stairs. On the lowest step, Mary stood for a long time. Her eyes eagerly searched the crowd. Slowly a puzzled, hurt look came over her face. June came to her side after a little while.
Isn't he here? No, not yet. I'm sorry, June said, touching Mary's arm lightly. It's all right. It's early yet. I'll just sit down by Miss Bestra's chair and wait for him.
She turned from June and went to the chair. Before she could sit down, a space corporal came over, bowed, tried to take a hand. She shook her head. He smiled twistedly and walked stiffly away. Another man smiled at her. She shook her head slowly. Someone came in the front door and she leaned forward, and she slumped back limply. She heard a tinkly laugh. She looked in its direction. She met Anne's eyes, bright and amused. Just then Miss Bestris came in, her eyes angry and her cheeks flushed. She strode across the room. Well, she said, I'm glad to see you finally came down. She sank heavily into her chair. Crescent's back. They just brought her in. The idiots came right in with her. I'll bet I lost 6 customers. These earthmen are sensitive about such things. Mary was still staring at the door. Miss Bestris looked down at her. Well, what are you sitting here for?
Please, Miss Bestris, I'm waiting for my special boyfriend tonight.
She snorted and looked away. Why isn't he here?
He will be.
He'd better. I'll let you wait another half an hour, that's all.
Thank you, Miss Bestris. You're very kind to me.
I indulge you more than I ought to, child, she said. More than is good for you, if the truth are known. The man came in. Mary stiffened and then relaxed. The mutter of voices blended into a steady hum. More couples were dancing. Miss Bestris moved around the room. The music was tinny. Another man came in. Your time's up, Madame told Mary.
Please, let me just wait for another few minutes.
Miss Bestris fixed her lips grimly. I've had enough nonsense for tonight. You heard me.
Please.
You heard what I said.
Miss Bestris, I couldn't. Not tonight. Honest, I couldn't. If I had to talk to anybody, I'd break down and cry. He'll... I know he will.
Miss Bestris whirled on her. Listen, you little... But she stopped suddenly. All right, she said, gritting her teeth. I can't afford another scene tonight. But you'll be sorry for this. Miss Bestris stormily looked away. The dancers danced. The music swelled louder. Gradually, deliberately, the lights were waning. Haven't I always been good to you, Mary? The madame asked.
Yes.
Then, like an obedient girl,
Do as I say. If he hasn't come by now, he just won't. He's gone to some other house." "No," Mary said doggedly. "Just remember tomorrow how you deliberately disobeyed me. Your silly emotions are costing me money, and that's one thing I simply won't stand for." "Oh, come," Mary said. "You won't lose money."
Couples sat side by side, laughing, talking in whispers. Occasionally there were giggles. The room began to empty slowly. The lights continued to dim until the rooms were gloomy. Even the shifting shades of the color organ were no more than a faint ambience. Anne, laughing, helped her second mate to his feet. "I'll give you one more chance," Miss Bestress said. "The next man that comes in."
"No, I just couldn't. Not tonight."
A few more customers drifted in. Then even the stragglers stopped coming. It was very late.
"It's deserted you. You see that now?" Madame Bestress sneered.
Mary stood up. There were tears in her eyes.
"You can't. You don't know how I feel," she choked. "You don't care."
She turned and ran up the stairs, crying. Several Earthmen, still in the big room, turned to watch. The torches were misty twinkles now. The last couples climbed the stairs, and then Miss Bestress, too, went to bed. The blue morning came. The town awoke. Commerce began. At 7, Miss Bestress lay in bed frowning, considering the events of the previous evening. But she was not so annoyed that she forgot to call a doctor on the teleview and arrange for him to come at 9 to give a physical examination. Her beau got to bed. She dressed and went to the kitchen to brew a pot of hemp tea. The cleaning maid, moving about in the next room, heard Miss Bestress call sharply, "Flavia, come in here." Flavia appeared with a dust rag in her hand. "Did you cut this cake?"
"No, ma'am."
Miss Bestress glowered. "That little idiot! She must have slipped down here after we were all asleep and sat here and cried her silly little eyes out. If she thinks she can pull that lovesick act on me, she'll soon find out different. Am I supposed to put up with having her moon over every space tramp that comes in? Why, I've taken more from her."
"Yes, ma'am."
Miss Bestress waddled to the stairs, climbed them determinedly. At Mary's door she stopped and twisted the knob. Locked. Miss Bestress hammered. "Open up, Mary!" The door rattled under her hand. "Open that door at once!" No answer. Miss Bestress pounded harder. "Open up, I say!" Anne sauntered into the hall, her dressing gown swishing. "She really made you look the fool last night, didn't she?" Anne said lazily. You slut! Mind your own business." Anne smiled and shrugged. "Open the door, Mary. Do you hear me? Open it." "Maybe she killed herself," Anne said. "It has happened." "My God! No! She wouldn't dare. You think she would?" Anne shrugged again. "They do funny things sometimes." Miss Bestress's face was red. "Run down and get my keys in my desk. You know where they are. Then, for God's sake, hurry." While she waited, Miss Bestress rattled the door, pleading and cursing. Finally, Anne returned. Miss Bestress snatched the key with a shaking hand. She hurled the door open and burst inside. "See here, you little—" She stopped. The room was empty. On the neatly made bed reposed a little stack of money. When Miss Bestress got around to counting it, she found that it contained exactly 910 Dordocs. End of story 16. Story 17 of The Almighty Dollar in Space. Fred Reed, Short Sci-Fi, Volume 6. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Synthetic Hero by Erik Fennel. Every day people travel great distances to stand in silence before the statue at Southwestern Spaceport. It is a shrine. The figure stands with arms raised in an upreaching, yearning gesture that invokes thoughts of man's potential greatness, and the face seen beneath the helmet wears an expression of inspired nobility and idealism. In the indestructible impervium ally image that is his masterpiece, Haydn Brush successfully captured the spirit of enthusiasm and adulation which swept the world. In a strange way, it is not so much a statue of an individual as of an idea, for the sculptor worked entirely from photographs taken with a telephoto lens. He never met his subject. A plaque on a granite base carries numerous words: sacrifice for the greater good, advancement of man's frontiers, conquest of disease and death, and a name, George Carlin. Whenever I read that, I recall the ancient witticism about this history being the fabric of accepted lies. In it there is much truth. On the moon is another shrine, unvisited because the surface of Luna is still a perilous and inhospitable place. No compelling work of art is to be found there. Nothing but a roughly circular blasted area containing scattered fragments of spaceship hull that scorch in the direct sunlight and freeze in the unrelieved darkness, riddled by colonies of creeping moonlights that penetrate the toughest metal. That is the real, the veritable shrine. The idea of building a spaceship did not enter George Carlin's mind until after he contracted the dread, and at that time incurable, Matson's disease. And then he thought of it only as the most spectacular form of suicide ever devised. That was typical of the man. George Carlin, owner of Carlin Industries and indubitably the richest and worst spoiled individual on the North American continent, was an irresponsible egocentric who had never done anyone a good turn in all his 36 years of life. Bad turns he had done in plenty. Take just this one example. A doctor had the effrontery to submit to a medical journal an article suggesting a possible connection between the bone-destroying virus infection called Matson's disease and Carlin Industries' highly profitable operations in thawing Antarctic areas with atomic heat. He hinted that age-old spores might have been released from the melting ice and been carried to seaports. Carlin's private intelligence operatives got wind of the article before publication, and Carlin himself ordered that measures be taken. The campaign was short and filthy, ending with the unfortunate doctor discredited and barred from practice on framed evidence. The article was not printed. And then came a morning when George Carlin noticed a slight soreness in his ribs, and his fingers detected a peculiar flexibility. For a while he could not believe it. Such things just did not happen to him. To others, perhaps, but he was above them, for he was George Carlin. But when the symptoms not only persisted but increased, he was at last forced to a realization of doom. Gradually his bones would soften and dissolve, until in a year or two he would be a mere lump of quivering flesh, without a skeleton to give it shape. He did not tell his physician. That was useless, for the atypical plague had defied all efforts of medical science. Instead, he reacted in characteristic fashion by getting grossly and disgustingly drunk. During the hangover, he decided upon suicide. There was nothing unique about this. Thousands upon thousands of victims had taken a short road, rather than helplessly endure the horrors of the final stages. But mere suicide was not enough for George Carlin. He was not just anybody. He was different. With his money, it had always been easier to arrange spectacular gestures than to force himself through the hard work necessary for more constructive achievements, and the substitutes had been just as satisfying to his ego. This habit of thought persisted even in planning his own death. Vern Harris was an obscure junior engineer at one of Carlin Industries' minor branch plants. A confidential report rated him as extremely brilliant and original, although somewhat visionary and inclined to overlook commercial possibilities. His very obscurity was one of the reasons he was placed in charge of constructing the spaceship. He could be handled, and the impression would be given in all publicity releases that George Carlin himself was the moving force. Carlin was annoyed at their first personal interview. Harris appeared fascinated by the technical problems presented, and insufficiently impressed by George himself. Carlin felt slighted, but Harris possessed the ability. The only stipulations upon which Colin insisted were that work be rushed and that all major arrangements should be made through him personally. It pleased him to keep the reins in his own hands. And so the spaceship went into design and then production, with all other projects of Colin Industries postponed or cancelled outright. Nothing, absolutely nothing, was allowed to interfere, and money was no object. Once Harris recommended that 3 particular specialists be hired to work on the navigation equipment. When Colin discovered that the men were under exclusive contract to American Calculator Company, which did not wish to release them, he issued orders backed by $80 million. When the flurry of reorganization was over, he owned majority control of American Calculator and took revenge for the slight delay by instituting policies that soon forced the other directors into bankruptcy. 7 months later, the ship lay in its launching rack on the Arizona desert. It was sleek and relatively small, built to carry a single man and fuel for a one-way trip to the moon, with oxygen and supplies to last 5 weeks. Harris had performed miracles of design, including several intricate devices intended to ensure a not-too-rough landing, and in the nose compartment was stored a huge folding reflector and high-intensity light, which could be set up and operated from the ship's electron displacement power packs. Trajectory and power settings had been worked out and set up in the automatic control equipment. The ship was intended to land in the dark of the moon. As Harris had calculated, it would be easier to generate heat than to dissipate it on an airless surface. Harris tried to explain to Colin why he had not used the almost unlimited power of nuclear fission in the driving rockets. No shield against the deadly radiations had been devised, and a human would have lived less than 5 minutes. But Colin had not been interested. He lacked a technical education, and he was quite content that the ship was incapable of a round trip. It was more spectacular that way. There had been a tremendous barrage of publicity throughout the construction period, but all of it dealt with Colin Industries or George Colin himself. Not a single public mention of Vern Harris had been made. Colin had spent those several months alternating between prolonged drinking bouts and periods of flogging his organization to ever more frantic activity. Anything to avoid thinking. And it required increasingly clever and time-consuming use of cosmetics to hide the progress of his disease. Concealment was a compulsive psychological necessity, for Matson's disease was so common, so plebeian, that he felt deeply ashamed. More and more he insisted upon being entirely alone, afraid his secret might be discovered, conducting his affairs by telephone and radio. Then one evening, with the ship awaiting only final loading, Harris drove over from the technicians' camp to the luxurious desert villa which Colin had caused to be built near the launching site. The 2 men had come face to face only 6 times. It was a thinner, older-looking Vern Harris than the young engineer who had accepted the assignment with such enthusiasm, and the haggard lines in his face showed the almost inhuman lengths to which he had driven himself. "Arrangements for the liquid oxygen are complete, and I'll be ready to blast off Tuesday morning, right on schedule." The engineer opened the interview. "I came over to thank you for the wonderful opportunity you're giving me, and I promise you, sir, that I shall make the most of it." Colin came out of his chair with a roar. "You don't think you are taking that ship out?" he bellowed. Vern looked profoundly shocked. No words had passed between them about who was to handle the vessel, and Harris had assumed unquestioningly that it would be he. It was only logical. Colin had been smart enough to let him think that way, knowing that thus he would receive Harris's greatest efforts. "Then who is?" the engineer asked. "Me. I'll take it myself. That's why I had it built." Harris looked incredulous. "But why?" Colin did not believe he owed him any explanation. He was receiving a fair salary, but something, perhaps a couple of drinks, made him speak. "The ship is my way out," he said, "a way by which I shall be remembered. I have Matson's disease." "The ship is my way out," he said, "a way by which I shall be remembered. I have Matson's disease." If he expected sympathy, he was disappointed. "So have I," Harris announced. "Can't you see?" Colin could, now that his attention was called to it, that subtle softening of the lines. A flush spread across Harris's hollowed cheeks, and his eyes took on an almost maniacal glitter.
"Look here, you. To you, this is just a great big childish show-off trick. Like those people who hesitate and draw a big crowd before jumping from some tall building. It will accomplish just about as much. You'll either louse up the controls and crash, or else you'll have enough liquor aboard to stay in a drunken stupor until your oxygen runs out."
Colin, livid at those outrageously disrespectful words, tried to break in as Harris continued in mingled pleading and fury.
"My God, man, don't you see what this means? This is the first spaceship ever built without scrimping and cutting expenses. This one will reach the moon without crashing. Why do you think I had it equipped with all sorts of scientific instruments? And why do you think I put so much thought into that light flash communicator?"
A thought came to him.
"Good Lord, you probably don't even know Morse," he said disgustedly.
Colin spluttered.
"I had planned a definite program of investigation," Harris continued. "Physical studies of the moon's surface, astronomical observations without atmospheric interference, collection of experimental data that could forward the progress of spaceflight by at least a century. And you, an untrained individual who knows nothing but money, would throw away that chance merely to satisfy your ego."
Colin looked thoughtful and made a few remarks about reconsidering the matter. He could be extremely sly and devious when that would gain his ends, and Vern Harris was completely taken in. But Colin was taking no chances on having his show spoiled by some pipsqueak engineer he could buy and sell 10,000 times over. It was easy enough, with his money and influence, to have Harris adjudged insane and quietly committed to an asylum. The matter was attended to the next morning. Colin spent the night before blastoff alone in his desert villa. He had been given orders not to be disturbed under any circumstances, so he was not informed that Harris had escaped, and he had enough drinks during the evening to miss the sound of a window catch being jimmied and the tiptoeing footsteps behind him. Only when the hypodermic needle plunged into the muscles of his neck did he know anything was amiss, and then it was too late. He awoke 5 days later in a hot and dingy furnished room in a nearby city. His clothes were strange, cheap, and did not fit. In his pockets was a large roll of money, and nothing else. Even the signet ring had been removed from his finger. He was ravenously hungry, and after a period of indecision, he went out in search of a restaurant. Less than a block away, he passed a newsstand. "Colin lands on moon," the headline screamed. Almost the entire front page was devoted to the story, and several inside pages recounted in greatest detail how George Colin had come out to his ship alone, his body taped and encased in a bulky pressure suit, mumbled a "no comment," which had produced a deeper impression than any elaborate speech, waved once to the huge throng that had gathered, and then left Earth in a blast of flame while every telescope in the hemisphere swiveled to follow his flight. George Colin walked into a liquor store and pointed to a very superior brand of whiskey.
"Give me a bottle. No, make it 2.
Then he went back to the room in which he had awakened. He had no place else to go. For the 100th time, he searched himself for some proof of identity, and for the 100th time, found nothing. For hours he sat with his head in his hands, trying to think of something to do. Finally, he opened the second bottle. Next day, the headlines read, "Colin reports life on moon." George Colin had no cosmetics with which to hide the increasingly visible ravages of his illness. He bought a supply of food as well as liquor, and did not emerge for another 6 days. Thus he missed the period in which the world waited with bated breath for further news from the moon. It was during this time that a spontaneous wave of mass emotion swept the world, and George Colin became a hero. The grasping evil deeds of the organization he headed, and they were numerous, were forgotten. No publicity staff could have produced such a reaction. "Colin believes discovered cure for Matson's disease." The newspapers brought out their largest type, and public acceptance verged on hysteria. Reports from the moon were carefully condensed, for the power available from the electron displacement packs was strictly limited, and every flicker of light must be made to count. Colin did not even sign his name, but all the world knew who he was. The story, as pieced out and expanded by the news services, was this. On the moon, Colin had found creatures resembling the terrestrial louse. They looked like insects, but they were of an entirely different chemical structure, and their metabolism was suited to their airless surroundings. Their food was apparently any metal or ore. While he was engaged in setting up the reflector, working in darkness and terrible cold, one of these tiny creatures had climbed the leg of the Pioneer's armored suit and punctured it, eating its way through the metal shell and rubberized fabric liner. Only hasty application of an emergency patch had prevented disaster from loss of air. The man had run to the shelter of his ship, but before he could remove his armor, the alien creature had bitten him on the upper leg. There had been excruciating pain from the venom the thing injected, and a large ulcer had since developed. But the dots and dashes reported the course of Matson's disease had not only been arrested, but reversed. His bones were hardening again. Perhaps under proper conditions, the venom might... It was the first hint that the Pioneer had been suffering from the deadly plague, and public sympathy and fascination multiplied. George Carlin bought more whiskey. 2 days later, the light on the moon winked again. A rough analysis of moonlouse venom showed it to be a complex pseudo-protein with silicon substituting for carbon and chlorine for oxygen. There followed a series of recommendations that set the press and radio of the world completely wild. There was almost no questioning of the wisdom of the voice from the moon, only acceptance and enthusiasm that swept aside all hesitation. Within hours, the leading governments of Earth had pooled their resources in one gigantic effort. The officers of Carlin Industries accepted the message as a command from the owner, and all personnel who had had anything to do with construction of the first spaceship were assigned to supervisory and coordinating positions. 15 spaceships were to be built at top speed, and each was to carry to the moon as much excess fuel as it could lift. There, all fuel would be transferred to one ship, which would return with a supply of living moon lice. Thousands of welders were at work on the plates of a huge, hermetically sealed laboratory building, while an army of machinists prepared the vacuum pumps and huge refrigerating machines that would reproduce lunar conditions for the alien creatures, and special laboratory equipment was being assembled. But George Carlin knew little of all this. One more message flashed from the moon. The Pioneer was dying. His Matson's disease had been cured, but the ulcer was spreading into vital areas. However, he suggested, tiny doses of diluted venom administered over a long period of time might... The message ended in the middle of a word, as through the telescopes astronomers saw a great flare go up from the moon's surface, 1,000 times brighter than the communications light. The explanation was self-evident. Electron displacement power packs were treacherous. When their stored power reached a certain minimum level, they became highly explosive. The Pioneer had sacrificed his remaining days of life to transmit vital information to the world which had given him birth. Everything stopped for a day and night as the entire civilized world went into deepest mourning for the man who had died 238,840 miles away. Everything but work on the fleet of spaceships. That did not even falter. George Carlin gave up his rented room, bought a car, and drove across country to the Midwestern city housing the headquarters of Carlin Industries. He didn't get past the outer offices. Carlin Industries had been forced long ago to develop a system for handling cranks and crackpots, and it operated only too well. Matson's disease had made such changes in Carlin's features that he was not recognized. At last, he was forcibly ejected. That was his final effort. He had become a nonentity, a nobody, and so he wanted only to die. But with his identity, he had lost his nerve. He did, however, have enough money to avoid drawing even one sober breath. It is history how 9 rockets reached the moon, transferred their remaining fuel, and one finally returned bearing a cargo of living moon lice as a gift beyond all price. The frantic medical campaign, during which 2,000 victims of Matson's disease had their deaths hastened as doctors sought the proper dosage, is also history. But then there was a cure, and another, and still more. The treatment became standardized. as means were found for stabilizing the venom and controlling its potency. The government assumed charge, and every citizen afflicted with the plague was not only entitled to treatment, but compelled to take it. When the health officers found George Carlin in his isolated cabin, he was almost dead. His skeleton had softened to such an extent that he could not stand, and could crawl across the dirty, littered floor only with the greatest difficulty. His atrophied muscles had almost nothing against which to work, and malnutrition and alcoholism complicated the case. After 6 months in a sanitarium bed, he had recovered enough to become bored. He borrowed a book from the man in the next bed, and was disappointed to find it an advanced treatise on rocket fuels. But he read it through, and surprised himself by becoming interested. Still flat on his back, unable to move, he began an intensive course of study. He had been so nearly boneless when admitted, one of the most advanced cases to survive, that the complete cure took 3.5 years. When he was finally released, he had learned enough to obtain a minor job as technical assistant, under an assumed name, in the Carlin Institute for Research, which had replaced the old Carlin Industries. He'd been there 14 years now, trying to compensate for lack of brilliance by earnest effort and long hours. He still has one dream. He hopes someday to stand on a barren, airless spot marked by twisted fragments of a spaceship. And he hopes Vern Harris's spirit still hovers there to hear his apologies. He has long since given up trying to have his story believed. The myth is too deeply embedded in the public consciousness, and no one has ever heard of Vern Harris. Even the history books teach the children that George Carlin was the first man to reach the moon alive. The last time he attempted to tell the truth, he was excoriated as an evil-minded muckraker, probably insane, and received a fractured nose at the hands of an irate listener for maligning a world hero. So he has surrendered to the inevitable. How do I know all this? Once I was George Carlin. End of story 17. Story 18 of The Almighty Dollar in Space. Ed Reed Short Sci-Fi, Volume 6. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Never Got You to Wampus by Winston Marks. I'm not exactly broke, but this Major Daphne owned more planets than I do golf balls. Whereas my mining interests were mostly on Earth, the Major got in early on the Centaurus grab. A whole generation later, all I could stake out was one hot little hunk of tropical mud that no one else would fool with. Daphne liked to kid me about my galactic empire every time we collided at the club. I was a bachelor, and Daphne was married, but he spent more time there than I. It was a bear of a man with a bull moose voice, the chest and shoulders of an ape, the appetite of a goat, and the models of a rabbit. There were few wealthier men in the system, none half so noisy about it. His favourite approach to bragging was to tell of his interstellar hunting expeditions. It costs money to push even a private boat around out there, and nobody but a fat-headed, ostentatious trillionaire would consider blowing $500 million to shoot a brace of pink-eyed grouse, or travel a parsec to blast a 2-ton Lartesian lizard. He nailed me one morning in the slime bath at the club. I was soaking out a hangover and a few wrinkles and a filthy antibiotic goo up in health service, when Major Daphne charged in with a towel around his fat middle and plunked down in the next vat. He splashed a gob of the vile-smelling green stuff in my face, and I cursed him out. He bristled at me as he settled his bulk on the sunken stool. "Young man," he growled, "profanity is a luxury of the uneducated lackeys and foul-mouthed jackals. Which are you?" "Splash me again, and I'll come over and drown you in this snot," I told him. He squinted under his grey eyebrows and roared, "Oh, it's my empire builder friend. Say, when are we going hunting on that free-floating pimple of yours?" "When are we going hunting? You never so much as bought me a drink, and all of a sudden we were buddies. "What's the matter?" I said. "Run out of game on your private preserves?" "Just looking for amusement, my boy.
I put a hole in a dozen of every species on 17 planets, covered all my Centaurus holdings, but never did get around to what do you call that little spitwad of yours." He sounded serious, and an idea popped into my head. "That little spitwad is Turgish 2, and it happens to be the hottest big animal planet in the system." "Sounds gamey." He nodded. "Have you looked around it much?" "I'd made only one trip to drop off a prospecting party on the North Polar Plains. That was 2 years ago, and all the word I'd had since was a couple of double-taking messages relayed from Centauri 3, asking either double wages or immediate pick-up and dismissal for the whole party. Sometime in the near future I must get out there and investigate personally, but I've been stalling the trip to accumulate the liquid assets it took to lease a ship and outfit from the main base on Centauri 3. "Been all over it," I lied. "It's not much for comfort, but it's hell for targets. Some really big stuff out there." This last was true. In the week I'd spent on the edge of the grassy plateau, I'd seen a number of herds of heavy-bodied four-leggers galumphing about. "We'll make up a little party," the Major decided. "Get yourself and your friends out to Centauri 3, and I'll provide a small craft and the gear for the hop over to what did you call it?" "Turkish 3, I told him happily. This was what I had hoped. The $80,000 passage out to the system I could afford, and with Daphne footing the rest of the bill, I would save myself quite a piece of change. "How many would be in your party?" he wanted to know. "I'll send word ahead for suitable accommodations and supplies." "I hunt light," I told him. "That'll be just me." You must be nuts about the sport. You don't mind if I bring along a little diversion?" "It's your party," I reminded him, more to confirm that he was expected to foot the bills than just to be agreeable. "I'll keep my party small, too," he promised. "Just the wife and a few nieces." The Major and his party were already gassed and crated when I arrived at the space deck for the big jump, so it wasn't until I pulled the needle out of me on Daphne's planet and main base that I got a look at his wife and nieces. From that moment until we put down on Turkish 2, the shuttle trip was one continuous party. Beside Daphne there was Angelica, his legal wife, and 6 variously hued, large-breasted, slender-hipped young women, each of different planetary origin and talents. When we were gathered in the cushion-lined salon of the Major's cozy 200-foot hunting craft, he introduced them in 2 sections. "My wife, Angelica," he said with a casual bow in her direction, "and my nieces." His face brightened with pleasure as he regarded them tumbled around on the billowing underfoot. Although the costumes were of different colors, they were all of singularly identical design. They wore one-piece dresses, demurely high-necked, puffed at the shoulders, belted to the narrow waists. And that was all. The flounced skirts stood out as if heavily starched, but they rippled and floated in diminished gravity with the most titivating effect. Angelica wore pants. I said I was charmed, but actually I was appalled, especially when the Major explained, "I only brought along 6 nieces this trip, 3 for you and 3 for me." Where I wanted to just leave Angelica. The ship lifted under us without warning, and we stumbled about in a gay tangle of giggles and heavy perfume. All but Angelica and me. We were thrown together, and we lay on our sides motionless, nose to nose, staring into each other's eyes. "Hello," I said. She heaved herself up against the 2G pressure and leaned on an elbow, regarding me with quiet grey eyes. Her skin was white, but it was still a relief when she answered in unaccented English. "Hello," she answered. "Thank heavens you speak Earth." At our feet Daphne was tumbling up his galactic geishas with lusty shouts of laughter and gabbling in 6 different dialects. "Are you a linguist?" she asked. I shook my head, and she smiled for the first time. "Good," she exclaimed. "You'll get tired of that bird talk and pay some attention to me." She sold herself short. Conversational boredom was the least likely reason I would seek the company of this fabulous creature. Daphne was completely engrossed with 2 wriggling, giggling extraterrestrials at the moment, so I rolled back and took in the rest of my hostess with an indiscreet survey. In grey slacks and high-neck T-shirt, she presented the ever-pleasantly mysterious enticement of the fully clothed female. Already my interest in the nieces and their leggy displays faded in favor of the one possibly forbidden morsel aboard.
I reached out to touch the unbelievable platinum hair, but she frowned a warning.
"Look, but don't touch,"
she said softly. I misunderstood, but Daphne put me right on the subject. He was looking over at us. "You're wasting your time," he called. "She's colder than a methane popsicle. A real chip off of Jupiter. Let's eat, what do you say? Come, Nellie, produce." Anelica sighed.
"That belly of his, life is one continuous smorgasbord. Excuse me, Mr. Frost."
She rose cautiously against the double gravity, but even under these circumstances not a line of her firm curves drooped excessively. She was, I guessed, early 30ish, judging from her mature manner, but she was firm and resilient as a girl of 18. The nieces had tired of scuffling in the heavier pull of out-acceleration and lay with their cunning costumes plastered to their limp, moist bodies. The Major tried a few last tickles, but the responses were unsatisfactory grunts of fatigue. He hauled himself over to me. "Great girl, that Nellie. She's my gun-bearer. By the way, what weapons do you use?" "Whatever you brought along," I said. "This is your show." "Good, good. They ought to outlaw those nasty little nuclear sidearms. No sport at all. I'm a powder and lead man myself. Give me a good rifle any day. Primitive but positive, if you know what you're doing." In amazement I asked, "You use inert projectiles, an unknown game?" "Certainly. Oh, I've had a few close ones, but I learned my lesson in Africa. I got over my impulse to gut-shoot everything that ran at me." He showed me a wrinkled red scar on one shoulder at the base of his bull neck. "You never want to gut-shoot a lion. He keeps coming. Lead has plenty of impact, but it mushes up and loses its shocking effect on the entrails. You gotta break a bone to be sure on these fast beasties. Same thing's true with most of these wampuses." "Wampuses?" I asked. "It's what I call any fast-moving game that wears its skeleton on the inside," he explained. "Some on every planet, carnivorous, teeth, claws, and a hell of an appetites, about all they have in common. Come in all shapes, but main thing is they come at you fast. A lion covers 100 yards in a little more than 3 seconds. Some of these extra T's do better than that." I tried to look casual, but the truth was that I'd never fired at a living target in my life. "Never gut-shoot a wampus," he repeated. "Break a bone. That gives you time to finish him off." Our sanguinary conversation ended with the appearance of a circular tray loaded with food. It slid in silently, supported from a silvery overhead trestle. When it reached us, it lowered to the pillowed deck, and the Major fell to with both hands. He'd eaten only a few bites when the uncomfortable plummeting of the food down his gullet reminded him of the heavy pull of acceleration. He threw back his head and roared into the concealed microphone overhead. "Ease off to 1G, Captain. A man can't enjoy his food." After a brief pause, a man's voice answered.
"We'll have to replot the orbit, and it will cost us several days at lower acceleration, Major."
"Ease off while we eat, then pick it up again," Daphne snapped, oblivious to the work he was creating for the navigator. "And don't make me heave you when you do it, either." The pressure gradually diminished to normal Earth gravity. Daphne belched with relief. "That's better." Anelica was back. She and the girls joined Daphne, nibbling at the platters of meats and swallowing copious quantities of a golden, low-alcohol fluid they sucked from collapsible containers. "Better eat, Frost," Daphne insisted. "Be in free flight for a bit, and you want to keep up your strength. I can't eat well in free flight. Makes me gassy." I forced down a few mouthfuls of the exotic rations, wondering why a steward hadn't served us instead of Anelica. After the meal, the girls began to perform for us, 3 of them, singing, dancing, and producing weird music on tiny instruments they inserted in their mouths. The other 3, Daphne told me, were strictly free-flight artists from low-G planets. Anelica watched for a few minutes, then got up and followed the food tray as it drifted away from us. I went after her. In the galley I found her stowing the remnants back into refrigeration. She didn't wait for me to ask the question.
"Daffy dislikes personal servants," she said. "Robide servers are not practical on the smaller craft.
so I take care of our wants." She scraped some half-chewed food into a disposal unit and slipped the plate into a slot, the wife of the wealthy Major Daphne handling garbage, cook and gun-bearer. "You must love him very much," I said.
"Love?" She turned to face me. "What has love to do with anything?"
That was cue enough for me. I couldn't convince myself she was as frigid as the Major asserted, and I was right. She came into my arms like a hungry tigress. After the most interesting moment of its kind in my eventful bachelorhood, she peeled herself away and went back to her chores. I gasped. "Lady, what your husband doesn't know about you." "And he'll never find out," she said instantly. "He only holds precious things he can't have. My love, passion, call it what you will, is one thing he can't buy." "I'm afraid I don't understand," I said. "Why did you marry him if—"
"It was that or die a spinster. Every young man who looked twice at me disappeared. At first I thought Daffy would get tired of being married to a perennial virgin, but I was wrong. It's the only thing that has kept him interested in me."
I said, "I suppose it's a natural form of perversity for a man of his wealth and power." She whirled, hands on hips.
"Perverse? Yes, he's perverse, and perverted, and bestial, and greedy, boorish, cruel, inhuman, self-centered, insane, piggish."
She glanced over my shoulder and stopped. "And a completely devoted husband." Major Daphne slobbered behind me. He reeled through the entry, loose-lipped, dishevelled, and very drunk. He brushed me aside and lurched past me, arms outstretched. "My little Nelly's only one appreciates me." For a second, Angelica was a platinum-haired statue. Then she moved to meet him, bringing up an expert knee that struck too high to injure him, but low enough to crush the breath from his lungs. Daphne clumped down on all fours, gasping.
"He knows better than that,"
his wife said. It was such a cold-blooded blow that I reacted. "Maybe if you would give him half a chance," I said.
"I'll wind up as a niece," she snapped at me. "Wait until you see what happens to them."
"Shut up!" Daphne rolled to his side, doubled up, and glared at Angelica. "Shut up, Nelly, before I kill you." I left the domestic tableau to resolve itself and sought my cabin. I stayed there through the remainder of the heavy acceleration, but when we went into free flight, the Major dragged me out. The party was still in full force, with the 3 other girls doing titivating push-offs from wall to wall, convoluting their lovely bodies into incredible ballet formations which Daphne took keen delight in disrupting with licentious hands, like a spoiled child pricking colourful balloons. Each fiasco ended in shrieks of laughter and mock combat, until the Major was snugged back in his hold-down strap, promising to behave. Frequently he would raise his arms and aim an imaginary rifle. "Ka-chunk! Broke a leg that time, ka-chunk! Right in the hip!" Then he'd hollow over at me. "Never got you at him. Break a bone." Angelica remained bored and indifferent to the revelry. She drank sparingly and passed up 100 opportunities to be alone with me. She paid meticulous attention to her husband's wants, with the quiet efficiency and anticipation of a trained secretary. But I caught her eyeing me with a most provocative, speculating look. My experience with married virgins was too limited to interpret her glances. All revolved around the Major. When he ate, we all ate. When he overdrank and slept, we slept. I never did discover which 3 nieces were supposed to be mine. None paid me any attention, and Daphne, much to my relief, never insisted upon my activity in his bacchanalian affairs. Before we arrived at Tigers 2, I was quite fed up with my host, drunk or sober. His indefatigable sensual tastes wore on my nerves, but I still had no conception of the Roman carnival this was to turn into. We touched down a few 100 yards from my prospecting camp, which was located at the edge of the 200-mile plain. Daphne stowed the girls in their rooms like so many playthings, and the faceless captain announced that the ramp was down. At the first smell of the hot, humid, over-rich air, the Major reared back his head and said, "I like it." I had forgotten the rather exhilarating effect of the high oxygen content. Coupled with the low gravity, Tirgash too induced a mild euphoria on its human visitors. My planet was small and dense, and the rapid rotation, once every 7.5 hours, made for violent, capricious air currents and weather. "I'll hike over to the compound and check on my crew," I told Daphne, as the three of us bounced down the ramp. "Don't bother," he said imperiously. "We passed them on the way in. Meant to tell you, I've been checking on them. You've got a nice thorium deposit, but it's a mile under that mud down there in the jungle." He waved carelessly to the south. "What?" I said incredulously. "They were dissatisfied," Daphne said. "I gave them their furlough with pay. Like to have a place to myself, you know." "What goddamn right did you have to—" "Right?" He rolled the word around in his mouth as if it were a brand new concept. Then he chuckled. "Quit crying, they wanted off. I sent my ship after them, saved you a hunk of cash. Hauled their samples back, too." When I failed to respond, he continued, "Let's not spoil the trip over it. Tell you what, I'll buy the mineral rights from you. How's that?" "For a cold $1 billion, I said without thinking. He didn't bat a lash. "Throw in the exclusive hunting rights and it's a deal," he said. "She's yours to the core," I said quickly. "Minerals, animals, and vegetables." The cost of mining the thorium was completely beyond my means, and my previous efforts to sell the whole planet had met with offers of less than 1/10 of this amount. He tilted his head back to glance at Anelica. "Get that? Easy to remember. A round billy for the parcel." She nodded, and he turned back to me. "Congratulations, Frost. Now you're a billionaire. Let's eat. I'm hungry." Anelica produced a small hamper and followed along behind us as we strolled over toward the heavy greenery. I was still feeling weak. Having your only planet jerked from beneath your feet was not an experience I especially savored, in spite of the profit I realized. It gave me a better insight to Anelica's answer to my question, "Love, what has that to do with anything?" What Daphne wanted was his. He didn't need the minerals, and he was here at my invitation for the hunting. But let's not have any unpleasantness. Spend $1 billion and keep things friendly. He spotted a herd of heavy animals grazing a 1/4 mile away. Squatting, he waved us down in the deep grass. "We'll eat here," he said. "Keep an eye on those herbivores. They're close to the trees. See if anything comes after them." Centaurus was a faint golden ball above a high overcast. It was never meridian in the summer season, so the orb hung well up from the murky horizon to the south. Daphne seemed unaffected by the oxygen, but I had a feeling of well-being that approached intoxication. Anelica moved between us, spreading the lunch. For the first time on the trip, I felt genuinely hungry, and began popping morsels into my mouth before she was finished laying it out. I ate alone, however. The Major said, "I think I see a wampus." Without a word, Anelica departed and returned in a minute with 2 rifles. Strapped to her side was one of the nasty little nuclear pistols that her husband deplored. He took one of the rifles and lined out the telescopic sight in the direction of the herd. I continued eating until he ejaculated, "Blitzmachen!" On my knees I could see a brief commotion in the herd, and the gusty wind brought the wavering sounds of grunts and a shrill neighing. A flash of bright orange tore back for the jungle, dragging one of the smaller, lumpy herbivores that would have weighed 1/2 ton on Earth. So I was right. There was interesting big game on Turkish, too. Daphne sank into a tense silence. Anelica dropped beside me, but didn't eat. She sat on her legs, hands folded in her lap, while I rustled through the edibles hungrily. Finished, I stretched out in the dry grass that crackled under me, intending to take a nap. Daphne turned his head and whispered with irritation, "You people are making too much noise. Go on back to the ship till I get a line on what we're after." His wife shrugged, and we turned back, leaving the picnic debris with Daphne. When we reached the ship, she tossed her head and breathed deeply. "I like it out here. The air, it's wonderful." We sought the shade on the far side, out of view of the crouching Major, and lay side by side, facing each other. It was the first time we had been alone since the moment in the galley. I was determined not to upset her again, but she kept her gaze on my eyes, waiting, expectant. This time I answered her unasked question. No, you're oxygen drunk. Besides, there's no future in it, I said bluntly.
I know him, she said softly. He won't return until dark. This may be our last chance to find out about each other.
Find out what? Her lips drew into a faint pout.
Aren't you curious? About me?
While I was strangling for an answer, she went on.
And I must discover whether you're worth doing now what I must do some day.
Her lips were tight now. What is that? She didn't answer, but she moved her head closely, until her breath was sweet in my nostrils. My discretion vanished, and I reached for her. Our lips met, but she held our bodies apart with her hands. It was quite different. The kiss was long and exploring and thoughtful. And when my pressure against her fending hands grew more than she could bear, she rolled free and jumped to her feet.
It is worth it,
she declared, looking down at me with clenched fists and wide eyes. And for the first time I understood why the Major remained married to this lovely creature, in spite of her rejection of him. Watching her graceful limbs as she mounted the ramp, I felt sorry for Daphne, an emotion I had thought impossible. But here was a man, foolishly wealthy in every respect, but the one which counted most. My pity was short-lived. The night was short, but we slept less than half of it. Daphne chatted about the orange animal excitedly and made plans for the hunt. "There are a few of them around these parts," he said, "or else the herds of herbivores would be wiped out. We'll have to stake out bait to draw one, probably. Usually have to, anyway." He cleaned his rifle 4 times and paced the salon impatiently, awaiting dawn. Finally, he glanced at his chronometer and told his wife, "Get Sukhan, the darkest one. See that she's scrubbed down well. No perfume, understand?" It was the first time he had mentioned one of the girls to Anelika by name, and she paled. I wondered why taking a niece on the hunt with us bothered her after the comportment I had witnessed on the trip. In a half-hour, the 4 of us set out in the first pale light of a dawn that exploded quickly into pink daylight. The Major wore a wicked hunting knife in his belt, carried only a pint flask in his right hand, and his left arm was wrapped intimately around Sukhan's slender waist. Anelika carried the rifles. We had gone only a few yards when he stopped us. "You wait here," he said. Then he sipped from the flask and offered it to the beautiful dark-haired girl. She drank deeply and handed it back. He waved it to her with his satyr-like smirk, that she finish it. He watched until she was through. Then his left hand slid up to her neckline, grasped the material of the dress, and tore down with one powerful gesture. She staggered back, nude and startled. Daphne roared with laughter, clasped her around the waist again, and held out his right hand. "Nelly, my rifle. You wait here. Keep your heads down. No fair peeking, eh, Sukhan?" Anelika threw one of the 2 rifles she was carrying at him muzzle up. He caught it with the slap of his huge paw and pulled the girl forward with him. She was reassured now and giggling with anticipation. Somehow, the lecherous display was more revolting out here in daylight. I mistook Anelika's paleness for humiliation, and I didn't blame her. Why did he have to drag one of his damned concubines out here? We knelt down obediently, and before Daphne's head disappeared, he turned and shouted back, "If the Wampus gets me, remember no gutshots, Frost." I muttered to Anelika, "The man has nerve, anyway."
"You confuse bravery with selfishness. He insists on the first shot. Won't trust another member of a hunting party to hold his fire. He always stalks out ahead, like this,"
Anelika explained tensely. I had noticed that the niece carried no weapon, which brought up another question. "Does he always mix his pleasures?" I asked. She was in the act of withdrawing a long telescopic sight, which she must have had bound to the inside of her thigh. As she moved it to her rifle with feverish haste, she answered, "He is not mixing his pleasures. Sukhan is bait." Before this could sink in completely, a shrill, feminine scream tore faintly into the gusty wind and found us. I leaped to my feet. Halfway to the edge of the jungle, some 100 yards from us, I watched Daphne pushing the olive-skinned girl ahead of him with rough shoves. A deeper colour spread from her neck and swathed one shoulder and her side. He stopped and raised the rifle threateningly. She turned and fled toward the jungle. "What in God's name?" I shouted. "You can't help her," Angelica said hopelessly. "He's cut her jugular. If there's an animal in there, the blood scent will bring it out in seconds. If there isn't, Sukan is gone anyway." I stared down at my companion in horror. She had warned me about the fate of Daffy's nieces, but I couldn't have visualized anything this bestial. She looked up at me. "She will faint soon. There are worse ways to die. You will see." She arose to stand beside me. I threw my rifle to my shoulder, fully intending to fire the whole clip into Daphne's back. But three things happened at once. Sukan sank out of sight in the grass. An orange splotch ripped into the open, and the Major too sank down and levelled his rifle. The animal, even at this distance, was undoubtedly one of the Major's Wampus varieties. It was stilt-legged, but not clumsy like a giraffe. The long, thick neck swung left and right, tracing the scent of warm blood, and its cat-like body arched so high a man could have walked under it. The wind was directly at our back, and as the several human scents touched the animal's nostrils, it jerked the long-fanged mouth. Its belly touched the high grass in a quick crouch. Then it sprang in one deadly accurate leap that carried it 40 yards to the prostrate Sukan. Even in the light gravity, the orange blur did not rise in a high trajectory, and the Major had time for only one shot while it was in the air. The sound startled the beast as it settled on its prey, and it raised its ugly head high while Daphne slammed the rest of his ammunition at it with no effect. Angelica stood calmly as her husband dropped his rifle unbelievingly. The heavy-caliber bullets had failed to cause a quiver in the beast, but the shocking noise had made him nervous. At the moment when it seemed he would turn and run for the jungle, Angelica raised her rifle. Daphne saw her sight through the telescope.
"It's no use,"
he yelled.
"We need higher power charges. Gotta hide on him like it."
She pulled the trigger. The great animal pirouetted, bit at its own side, then wheeled, facing us. Even as it sprang, Daphne, who was only 20 yards from us, screamed,
"You got shot it, you clumsy."
His wife dropped her rifle instantly after the shot and drew the little nuclear pistol. I got off one shot as the beast reached the apex of its leap, but I think I missed. I kept waiting for Angelica's deadly hand weapon to speak, but she followed the arc of the raking talons all the way to the ground where they churned briefly. Daphne only screamed once. At last the pistol spat, just as the furry belly touched the grass in its third crouch. The leap came, but it was almost straight up. The slender pellet had entered the chest and cooked half the spine. The aimless floundering was reflexive spasm. Angelica grabbed my rifle and fired 3 quick shots at the impervious hull of the ship. It brought the captain and the 2 crew members to help us with the remains. Before they reached us, however, she was quick to secure Daphne's rifle and examine the chamber. Even with an eyewitness and 3 other witnesses after the fact, she insisted that we hack the head and claws from the monster carnivore. We packed them, together with her husband's shredded corpse, in the game freezer. When a financial personage of Daphne's stature dies on a strange planet, the investigation is most thorough. It wasn't necessary to take such pains with Sukan's pitiful remains. We buried her in Tigers too, where investigators could exhume her ripped body if they chose. The jugular slash was indistinguishable in the general lacerations. It was a nasty mess. It cured me from any slight pleasure in hunting and cost me the quickest $1 billion I ever had a chance at. Naturally, the deal was off without the Major to verify the verbal agreement. Anyway, with characteristic selfishness, he died intestate, which threw all his holdings into the courts. The greatest change the incident made in my life concerned the loss of my bachelorhood. A man could get his belly full of anything, even promiscuity, and Daphne's little hunting party did me that favor. I am still stuck with Turkish 2 and its mile-under-mud thorium deposit and orange-colored wampuses, but I have prospects. If the courts clear up the Daphne estate, my wife will own more planets than I have golf balls. So if you ever go big game hunting again, don't forget the Major's advice. I pass it on for you for what it's worth, although you may never aim at anything but a lion. Never gut shoot a Wampus. It's better even if you're only shooting blanks. And I don't feel a damn bit bad about the way Anelika loaded the Major's gun. End of story 18. Story 19 of The Almighty Dollar in Space. Ed Reed Short Sci-Fi, Volume 6. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Superjoemulloy by Scott F. Grenville. Joemulloy lounged in the plushest chair in his luxurious office. All around him, on the walls, on the ceiling, even in strategic spots all over the floor, there were mirrors. Joe sneered at the place where the mirrors were most profuse. 20 or 30 perfectly identical Joes sneered back at him. He admired his sneer from every angle, shaping and changing the contemptuous look on his face with his hands, stroking it, much as other young men in a far earlier age had stroked and twisted their fine moustaches. As usual, Joemulloy was engrossed in his two favorite hobbies, narcissism and indolence. Joel's friends, of which there were very few, could have given you a fairly accurate resume of his character in 5 words, his sneer and his indolence. In the first respect, they would have been right. Joseph Mulloy had been born with a sneer on his face. His whole early life had been centered around that sneer. It had enraged his father, distressed his mother, driven his teachers to tears, his playmates to tantrums. He stopped doing homework at the age of 8, but the teachers passed him on anyway, to avoid complete mental breakdown. Gradually, Joemulloy began to get his way in everything by virtue of his sneer. It was not merely openly supercilious. That was the beauty of it. It was so subtle, so faint, and yet such an open avowal of contempt for the entire human race, that try as the people he tormented would to find something in his sneer to charge him with, they never found anything. In a very few years, registration day at Joe's elementary school became a game of Russian roulette, having as the loaded chamber the question, who's going to get little Joey Mulloy in his class this year? Finally, when Joe Mulloy was 15 years old, the local Board of Education wisely decided to end Joe's formal education, rather than make screaming memes and occupational disease at the local high school. Joe's father welcomed the expelling as an excuse to beat him to a pulp and kick him out of the house. It was not until 3 days later that the memory of Joe's sneer, enduring through all the punishment he had received, made the father blow his brains out with the most accurate German Luger he could buy at the pawn shop on short notice. But Joe's friends would have been wrong in the second instance, for Joseph Mulloy was not chronically indolent. In his own profession, Joe Mulloy was the most industrious man imaginable. For Joe Mulloy was a robot builder. Disinherited by his father, he had made a beeline for the nearest positronics laboratory. The personnel manager had flatly refused him the job when he had told her he had absolutely no qualifications, but she was so disconcerted by his persistent sneer that she had to give him the job just to get him out of her sight. Once in the laboratory, he had gone right to work learning everything there was to know about robots, scorning all help from the other technicians. Since he held other scientists, past or present, in an ineffable contempt, he had to learn everything by experience instead of studying what his merely human predecessors had done. He was so empirical that he learned all about alternating current by deliberately sticking a wet finger in a light socket again and again. He made mistakes at first, of course. In fact, he ruined several $1,000s worth of laboratory equipment during his apprenticeship. But his amazing sneer conquered all, and he was soon recognized as the most brilliant and the most conceited man in the field of positronics. Now Joe Mulloy was lounging in a plush office chair, cultivating to near perfection his already mature sneer, and suddenly feeling maddeningly thirsty. "Robot?" he said. A startlingly human robot seemed to materialize instantaneously from nowhere.
"How might thy humble servant serve thee, O magnificent master?"
it inquired, bowing so low that its partially metallic nose scratched the rich mahogany floor.
"What took you so long, you damned fool?"
asked Joe.
"I apologize, gracious master. I am incompetent and worthless." "Get me a drink, you bucket of bolts,"
said Joe.
"I am grateful for a chance to serve thee, benevolent master,"
replied the robot in its monotonous Uncle Tom patter, and made another floor-scratching bow. Then it grovelled out of the room.
"That robot is getting too slave-like,"
said Joe to himself, after the robot had left.
"All my robots seem to be that way. They do exactly what I tell them to, and degrade themselves sickeningly before me. All the people I've ever known seem to be that way, too. I wish I could find at least one mind equal to mine to clash with. Then I could have a real fight for once. None of this bowing and scraping."
Just then, the robot entered with a Manhattan, made its usual floor-gouging bow, and scraped its metal feet to get Joe's attention. Joe turned to glare at the mechanical minion.
"Robot!" "Yes, omnipotent
the robot began, but Joe cut it off.
"Get over to the laboratory and blow yourself up, and find an empty corner where you won't do too much damage." "Master, I am happy for the chance to give my life—"
"Never mind that, you glorified erecticet. Do as I say."
"Yes, master."
The robot hazarded a slight bow, but forgot to crawl out of the room on its hands and knees in its eagerness to follow its master's orders. Joemulloy leaped to his feet. In the moment of his excitement, he forgot that melodrama is a human weakness, and he became melodramatic himself. Even his incorruptible sneer faded slightly as his excitement grew.
"I must find someone with a mind equal or superior to mine,"
he told himself.
"Now who has a mind equal to mine? Obviously no one but me. Therefore I must find someone with a mind superior to mine. Now who is superior to me?"
For the first time in his life, Joemulloy was confronted by what seemed an unanswerable question. Joe's train of thought was interrupted by a deafening explosion from the laboratory, as his latest robot jubilantly committed suicide. The building shook violently for a few seconds, then subsided. To his great surprise, he was able to answer his question.
"Of course, since the only thing equal to me is me, the only thing superior to me would be a super-me, a super-ego. I'll build a super-robot, with all my magnificent qualities, only magnified 1,000 times. I'll build a Superjoemulloy."
He ran the letters together to make it one word. Superjoemulloy. He dashed up to his laboratory, cleaned up the mess his overeager robot had made in killing itself, and went feverishly to work on his new project, learning the necessary techniques by experience, of course, and applying them to his super robot. He made some mistakes at first, of course, but in 3 weeks and 6 days, Superjoemulloy was ready for its debut in robot society. Not one to miss a chance to impress mere humans with his genius, Joe invited the world's greatest positronics experts to the unveiling of Superjoemulloy. There was a tense air of excitement as Joe pulled the lever that removed the big black curtain in front of the robot and started the activation machine. When they saw Superjoemulloy, the experts gasped with envy. It was impossible to tell the super robot from a human. Its limbs, torso, and head were so well proportioned and done in such fine detail that anyone in the room not in the know would have sworn that it was a human being. There were even fingerprints delicately cut into the super robot's artificial hands, and Superjoemulloy looked exactly like Joemulloy, except for the sneer. It was 20 times better even than Joe's own. It was a super sneer. But although the activation machine was working its hardest, nothing happened. The super robot refused to move one solitary mechanical muscle. Joe's guests began to file out once the novelty of the robot had passed. Joe left the room in disgust and went downstairs for a drink. When he returned to the laboratory, Superjoemulloy was on its feet, examining the laboratory equipment with obvious disgust. In the preceding few minutes, the super robot's super snare had grown more perfect, and the robot was fast becoming the very personification of contempt.
"Why didn't you move around when my friends were here, you heap of junk?"
Joe asked the super robot. Superjoemulloy turned to him.
"I didn't want to display my perfection before mere humans, you distorted blob of protoplasm," it said.
Joemulloy was becoming angry, but he tried not to show it. He downed his drink.
"Get me another,"
he told the robot, holding out his glass.
"The hell with you,"
said Superjoemulloy.
"What do you think you are, God or something? Just because you slapped me together with your clumsy butterfingers doesn't give you the right to order me around like some common servant. Now that you've created me, I could do a better job of robot building myself. Now get the hell out of here."
Joemulloy turned on his heel and stumped out of the room. No robot was going to talk to him like that. No, sir. The super robot quietly followed Joe to the door and gave him a kick that sent him sprawling down the stairs. At the bottom of the staircase, Joe whacked his face against the solid oak of the banister. He turned groggily to look at the blurred image of the robot standing defiantly at the top of the steps, with its hands on its hips. For a brief second, the sneer faded from Superjoemulloy's face and was replaced by an evil, sadistic leer. Joemulloy recalled the last line of Father William. "Now be off, or I'll kick you downstairs." But the super robot was far worse than Father William. A conceited, contemptuous monster, it was totally unlike Joe's warm, humble, self-effacing self. The snaring monster must be destroyed. Joe cunningly enticed the robot to leave the laboratory for Joe's office, where it could admire its snare in all the mirrors. Snaringly, Joe wondered why anyone could admire a snare so much. Without thinking, he used his hand to smooth out the wrinkles in his now slightly worn snare. Then he crept upstairs to his laboratory to barricade himself in there to think of a way to destroy Superjoemulloy. At last he hit on the answer, the hypnosis machine.
"The robot is mechanical, so I'll have to hypnotize him by mechanical means,"
Joe reasoned to himself. He worked day and night, learning the necessary techniques as he went along. He made some mistakes at first, of course, but in 4 days the mechanical hypnosis machine was complete. Joe found the super robot in the mirror-lined office, where it had been admiring and improving its snare for the last 4 days. The snare was magnificent, but it still lay just 1 iota short of absolute perfection. Try as the robot would, perfection in a snare still lay without its grasp.
"Genius!"
shouted Joe, to get the robot to turn its head. He turned the dial on the mechanical hypnosis instrument up to full power.
"You are now in my power."
But now Superjoemulloy's snare was completely perfect. With a look of sublime contempt on its plastic face, it took the hypnosis machine, turned it around, and aimed it right back at Joemulloy. Joemulloy bowed so low that he skinned his nose on the rich mahogany floor.
"Yes, master," he said. "Bring me a drink, you blot of living tissue," said Superjoemulloy.
Joemulloy made another nose-skinning bow and grovelled out of the room.
"This human is getting too slave-like," said Superjoemulloy to himself. "I suppose I could rebuild him, though."
Joe returned almost instantly with a Manhattan, made his usual nose-damaging bow, and scraped his leather shoes to get Superjoemulloy's attention. The super robot turned and glared at him.
"Human!" "Yes, master? Get up on that slab in the corner."
Joemulloy obeyed. With all the skill of an experienced human builder, Superjoemulloy began to take Joe's body apart. Joe screamed, but the super robot ordered him, by hypnotic command, to shut up, and Joe obeyed. Superjoemulloy began to put together a Superjoemulloy out of what had once been Joemulloy. He made some mistakes at first, of course. End of story 19. Story 20 of The Almighty Dollar. In space. Read Read Short Sci-Fi, Volume 6. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. You too can be a millionaire, by Noel Loomis. Mack Reynolds looked anxiously backward as he went up the street to the place where the faded gold lettering on one window said jewelry. That would be a good place to hide, he thought. Most of the plate glass windows and doors along the street were broken out, as in fact they were everywhere, and had been for 20 years. But one of the jewelry windows on the door, protected by iron grating, was still whole and would help to conceal him. With one final glance back at the corner, he climbed the grating, scuttled across it, and dropped down. Then, keeping low, he ducked in among the dusty old counters and stopped abruptly, listening. He heard Connolly's slow, slapping footsteps as the tall man rounded the corner and came up the street. He forced himself to breathe softly in spite of the pounding of his heart. The dust rose a little around him and got in his nostrils, and he wanted to sneeze, but by sheer willpower he choked it down. Connolly was from the machine, Central Audit Bureau, and the machine knew by now that Mark was 3,000 points in the red. 3,000 points when you were supposed to be always within 1 day's point of a balance. You were allowed 1,200 points a day, so Mark was now 2.5 days in debt. He'd been walking the streets in a sort of daze, signing slips right and left while his own pad of slips stayed in his pocket. He hadn't cared either until now, because in this brave new world of the one freedom from work, he was abominably unhappy. Everybody struggled all day to get enough points to stay even with Central, and what good did it do them? You got even 1 day, but the next day you had to start all over. There wasn't any point to it. So he'd said to hell with it, and for 5 days now had ignored the machine entirely, except to line up automatically once a day at the concourse to have his card audited. And for 5 straight days the balance had been in red. Then today he had seen Connolly on the street coming toward him. All of a sudden Mark had been scared. He didn't know what Central would do to him. Nobody knew. But he didn't want to find out either. He ran from Connolly. Now he crouched in the dust behind an empty counter while Connolly's footsteps approached. He held his breath when they got close, and when they passed the broken window, he was very thankful. It was late afternoon, and he thought Connolly would go back to Central. Nobody knew much about Connolly except that he represented the machine, and that he seemed to disappear within it every afternoon. So, presently, Mark crawled out of the broken window and walked down to Main Street. He looked carefully right and left, and then, not seeing Connolly's tall form above the traffic, he wandered slowly down the street, trying to figure things out. Why wasn't there anything worthwhile to do? What was the reason for all the broken windows and empty stores? Had there once been places where people could buy things like food and clothes? Maybe, before Central Audit Bureau had come into existence. Or had Central always been there? Mark saw the old lady sitting in the wheelchair. He turned out absently to walk by her. He saw her put a foot in his way, but his brain wasn't working. He stumbled over her foot. Instantly the old lady half arose from her chair as if in pain, shrieking and brandishing her cane, the leg held stiffly out in front of her.
"You've injured me," she shrieked in a raucous voice. "You've hurt my lame foot."
Mark stood there dumbly. He was a young man, and so he didn't at once foresee what was about to happen. A crowd gathered in no time. The old lady was putting on a show. Mark didn't get it. He would have allowed her 1,000 points, even 1,500, without argument. But he got the shock of his young life.
30,000 points,
she screamed at him, and tossed a pad of slips at him.
"Sign my slip, please."
Mark took the pad automatically. He took the pencil she held out. He started to sign. He'd never get a credit balance at the Central Bureau now, but he didn't care. Maybe he'd get in so deep they'd give him some work. The old lady's voice rose unexpectedly.
"My feelings are hurt, too. He did it deliberately. 5,000 points for my injured feelings.
Dazedly, Mark wrote down 35,000 and no more and signed his name. He handed the pad back to her and started on. The crowd was leaving. But a voice stopped him, a soft voice.
"Wait, son."
He looked back. He started to go on. Then he saw the old lady's eyes on his.
"Stick around,"
she said. There wasn't any raucousness in her voice now.
"Wait till the crowd goes. I want to talk to you."
Presently he was walking beside her while she laboriously operated the two big hand wheels that propelled the chair. 2 blocks away she turned into an empty building marked Groceries. Mark helped her cross the threshold. Inside, she amazed him by springing out of the chair and standing quite steadily. She was small, and she wasn't as old and wrinkled as he had thought.
"You get in the chair," she said. "I'll push you. I need the exercise."
A minute later she was pushing him briskly along the street while Mark sat, still half dazed, in the wicker chair. Her old red shawl was across his lap.
"Get cramps in my legs, to say nothing of my bottom," she observed. "Sitting there all day."
She saw him stiffen.
"Oh, you needn't be shocked. After all, I'm old enough to be your grandmother. I was born in 1940, you know."
1940,
Mark repeated wonderingly.
"Gee, that was back in the days when everybody worked. I wish I could work." "Well, it's a changed world," she observed. "In those days, you had to work."
At that instant, Mark heard the ominous slapping footsteps. He looked ahead, and there was Conley, easily noticeable because of the Type N hat a head above everybody else, coming toward them. Mark snatched up the red shawl and wrapped it around his face to the nose and pulled his hat low over his eyes. He watched him under the Type L brim while Conley approached. He held his breath while Conley fixed his deep eyes on him for a moment, but Conley went by, and once more he was safe. The old lady trotted briskly along. They passed a few people who stared at them, but Mark was thinking,
"This is 2021, he observed. "You're 81 years old. You must know all about things." "I'm quite spry," she pointed out. "Though I must say I'm working up a sweat right now. No, no."
She pushed Mark back into the chair.
"It's good for me. Don't get enough exercise anymore. Now you just sit there. You're in a bad way. Anybody who'd fall for such a phony act and release 35,000 points without even an argument, well, of course," she said archly, "I do have a well-turned ankle."
But the enormity of Mark's debit with Central when the old lady should turn in his slip began to worry him. He wondered if he could get it back from her. He wasn't happy with the world, and things were all wrong, and all that. But still, well, he did have to live in it. 35,000 points. He began to worry. He wished he knew what the penalty would be. He wondered if the old lady knew. What were these points all about anyway?
"You must know," he said, "how the world got into this mess."
She chuckled.
"For 35,000 points, I guess you got a right to the story."
She turned into the archway of a standard Type B apartment house. He wondered what she would do with all those points. What did anybody do with them? Everybody had about the same living quarters. Food was furnished by automatic vendors at the hydroponic farms. Clothes were provided ready-made. All you had to do was put your credit card in a machine, punch the buttons for your measurements, and a suit would drop down the chute. Mark got out of the chair and helped her inside with it. He took off his hat and started uncertainly to leave, but she put her hand on his arm.
"No, no, have supper with me. I'll tell you all about everything. Glad to. There aren't many who want to know about things anymore."
Her apartment was neat and clean. It was hard for Mark to connect it with an old woman shrieking points at him.
"My name's Pearl. Point plus Pearly, they call me. But my real name's Penelope. You can call me Penelope." "Thank you,"
Mark said gravely and sat down. Penelope bustled into an apron and began pulling packages from the freezer.
"We'll have a feed, you and I. A real feed," she chuckled pleasantly. "After all, you're paying for it."
Mark squirmed uncomfortably.
"I'll tell you how this all started,"
Penelope said, popping open a can of high-content protein.
"Back before you were born, there were insurance companies. At first they were started to insure your life, and—"
"Your life?" Mark frowned. "How?"
"Never mind. Also they insured you against loss by fire. Then it was loss by collision of vehicles. You've never seen an auto, of course, and so on. Finally they got to insuring you against hurting yourself when you slipped on a cake of soap in the bathtub. And then they insured against a suit for damages by someone who might stub his toe and fall down and break a leg on your sidewalk. Follow me?"
"I think so," said Mark doubtfully.
"Well, there are all kinds of lawsuits. Two men would be in an accident, both hurt. Their insurance companies would sue each other. Suppose A knocked over a ladder and B fell down on top of him. B's fall broke A's arm and it broke his own leg. A would sue B for breaking his arm. B would sue A for making him fall. Well, suppose A was insured by Company X and B was insured by Company Y. A and B filed claims against each other's companies and everybody went to court."
"You mean they didn't agree on damages?"
Mark asked incredulously.
"Exactly."
Penelope cut off the top of a bottle of enzymes.
"It was pretty dumb. But pretty soon the companies got wise. They formed working agreements. When two companies carried insurance on two persons involved in an accident, the companies just presented their claims to each other, and the one with the biggest claim against him paid the difference, while each company paid off the claim of the one it represented. You can see what eventually happened."
She punched a button, and a dinette table popped out of the wall.
Companies insured people for more and more types of damage, even against being insulted or against a claim for damages for being insulted. The big companies eliminated the small ones, and it was just a matter of bookkeeping among those that were left. Eventually, the government took over.
"But look," said Mark, "I don't see—"
"Don't rush me."
Penelope put a can into the container dissolver and punched the button that set out the plates and silverware on the tiny table.
"You see, pretty soon everybody was insured for everything possible. People were collecting right and left, mostly small amounts, but lots of them. But it took quite a bit of time to file claims and so on, and also a man spent all he made buying insurance to protect himself. It was a wicked circle. Nobody could quit buying insurance, and nobody dared quit filing claims. That's when the government took over. They simplified things. Once a day you turn your slips into Central and the machine audits your account. That's all there is to it."
"But there's nothing else to do," Mark objected. "No entertainment. No work."
"Why should there be entertainment? Entertainment means work for somebody. No, Central, which is the government, of course, has eliminated work for everybody, and at the same time has provided something to keep everybody busy. What work must be done is done by automatic, self-lubricating, self-repairing, self-renewing machinery." She sighed. "It's a brave new world. Everything is neatly worked out. Everybody spends all their time gathering points to offset the points they lose gathering points. And nobody seems to mind except a few rebels like you and me. I saw that rebellious look in your eyes when you signed my slip. That's why I invited you to come along with me. But as I said, Central keeps everybody busy all day and half the night trying to balance themselves. There's no labor problem, no unemployment, no relief, no worry about anything."
She paused to dip the vitamins out of the dissolver.
"The only catch is it's so damned monotonous."
Mark blinked, but Penelope whirled on him, the dissolver in one hand.
"Why do you think I sit out there and put on my act all day long? Not to get points, though I confess the points are the measure of my success, but because life is too dull otherwise."
She dished out the vitamins.
"You say the government did all this?" "Yes."
A thought struck Mark.
"Who is the government?"
Penelope was filling glasses from the ice-water faucet. She turned her head and stared at him like a bright-eyed bird.
"To tell you the truth, Mark, as far as I know, the men who used to make up the government disappeared after the last war, about the time all this automatic machinery was put in. We used to have an election every so often, but I haven't heard that word for 25 years. Do you know what I think?"
"No," Mark said attentively.
"I don't think there is any more government," Penelope said dramatically. "I think all that's left of the machine and Central Audit Bureau, which is nothing but a giant posting machine. Have you seen it? Central, I mean. I see the concourse where we line up every day to have our cards posted, but what's behind those 1,200 windows?"
She nodded briskly.
I saw it from one of the last planes. Central covers miles and miles in both directions. They said then it was the biggest machine on Earth, and do you know, Mark," she paused dramatically, "I think the machine is the government. Roll up your chair, Mark." Mark did. "But doesn't there have to be somebody to take care of the machine?" he asked, holding her chair. "Not that I know of. They said it was perfect, that barring an earthquake it would run for 1,000 years without a human hand." The iron juice cocktail was pretty good, the way Penelope had flavored it with enzymes. But Mark inevitably got back to the thing that worried him. "What will happen when that release slip of mine goes through for 35,000 points?" Penelope raised her white eyebrows. "I don't know, but undoubtedly something drastic. I'll tell you what, I'll hold your slip for a while, and you go and see if you can get some points on your credit side. Stir up a little trouble. Get the points first and argue after."
Mark went out and tried to get some points next day, but he couldn't seem to get his heart in his work. It was all so pointless. Why couldn't the old lady give him back that slip anyway? Mark got pretty much in the dumps, and after he managed to get his foot stepped on and demanded 300 points, only to be countered by a claim of 400 for hurting the other man's instep, he began to feel very low indeed. At the end of the week, he was walking slowly along the street watching for Conley, because he was getting further in the red every day, when he saw a foot stuck out in his way and heard a voice say, "Don't you stumble over my lame foot." And he looked up and saw the old lady. Her black eyes were soft. "You don't look happy, Mark." "No." He held out his card. Her keen old eyes shot back to his. 3,200 in the red. That's more than before. You've lost 200 points this week, Mark." "I know," he said dully. "Here, push me, Mark." She pulled the shawl around her, and Mark started pushing a wheelchair. "You're a nice boy," she said when they reached a quiet street. "You just can't adjust yourself to this modern world." "I want a job," Mark said stubbornly. "Something to do besides, well, some kind of mark to aim at, I guess. This point business is just putting in time. I'm not creating anything. Even if I could fasten zippers on feather beds, I'd be doing something worthwhile because it'd be used. But this way of living is like digging a hole and then filling it in again. Why, you don't even dare to get into a fight. Somebody will collect 1,000 points every time you hit him. The standard price of a black eye is 3,000. You have to be pretty careful about things like that, and there's always Conley." "Well," Penelope said, "I'm going to make you a proposition. I'll hold up your slip for 60 days, and in the meantime I'll teach you how to get ahead of the game. I'll teach you the tricks of the trade, just as old Point-a-Minute Charlie taught me. They say he averaged a point a minute all his life." "Where is he now?" asked Mark, interested. The old lady pondered. "Come to think of it, I don't know. I remember the last time I talked to him his credit balance was 98,000. She frowned at the tremendous low-lying dome that covered the horizon in the distance and marked Central Audit Bureau. "I haven't seen him since then." Said Mark. "Well, now," Penelope said briskly, "I'll make you a regular business deal. I'll teach you, and for all you get, you give me 20%. See how many you can get. Try for 10,000. That'll give you something to shoot at." "Maybe I can beat the machine," Mark said eagerly. Penelope swallowed. "They say you can't beat the machine, but I guess it won't hurt to try." Mark did well. At first he just walked down the street, stopping people as fast as he could get to them. "You don't recognize me, sir," he would say indignantly. "I met you at Central Concourse 2 years ago, remember? You stood right in front of me in line for 3 hours when you talked about our new suits, remember? My feelings are injured because you ignored me just now. 50 points. Will you sign my slip, please?" His credit reached the black the first week. He was netting 500 points a day, and it was fun. But Penelope said, "We'll go for bigger stakes. This is kindergarten stuff. Now here's the way you start." So in the morning, Mark managed to get himself knocked down 4 times. Each time he came up with a skinned knee and collected from 500 to 850 points. He was learning, Penelope assured him when he gleefully showed her his card at the end of the day. Mark was elated. That day he had gathered 5,100 points. "But this can get monotonous too," Penelope said. "Anyway, you can't go around forever with a sandpapered knee. You're learning fast and you're learning right. Point-a-Minute Charlie was the best there was in his day, and he always said you make more points guessing character than you do falling down. Know your victim before you have an accident, and then hit him for all he will pay and hit him quick, the way I did you," she chuckled. "My commission for today is 1,020 points.
Here, sign my slip, please."
Mark signed. It was a cheap price to pay for the fact that life was no longer pointless. He decided to try to gather a credit for 100,000 points. He worked on bigger stuff. He didn't try just everybody. He picked his signers with care. He slept until 9 every morning, and he and Penelope played two-handed bridge at 1/10 of a point until midnight. He felt sorry for the poor suckers who had to get out on sun-up and tread the sidewalks until dark to get enough points to satisfy Central. They were working like slaves, while he was living the life of Point-A-Minute Charlie. It was a lovely existence. He forgot about Penelope's slip of 35,000. He could almost pay it off anyway. Then came the day when he pulled his grand coup. He spent a week planning it, with Penelope's shrewd advice. He remembered what she had said about the man on the ladder in the 1940s. He sandpapered his back and painted an irregular spot with merthiolate and iodine, and practiced twisting his back until it looked out of shape. Then he went out and watched for an absent-minded, nervous, excitable-looking man to try his next effort on. Penelope's biggest advice was, "Preparation is half the points." So it was 3 days before Mark found the right person. After he found him, it was very simple. He signaled Penelope to follow, and then he walked behind the man until they came to a high curb. Mark moved out to the left. The man started to step up on the curb. Mark darted across in front of the man just as the man raised his foot. Mark managed to stumble exactly in front of the man. His arms went out and one hand caught the little man's leg. The little man fell squarely on top of him, assisted by a slight push from Penelope. Mark groaned heartbreakingly. In a moment there was a crowd. The little man was getting up bewildered and automatically trying to dust off his Type K suit. Mark lay half on the curb, half off, squirming like a broken-back snake. "My back!" he moaned piteously. "Oh, my back!" The little man seemed paralyzed at the enormity of the thing he had done. He stared at Mark, and Mark squirmed harder and moaned louder. Then Penelope hobbled up and pulled Mark's shirt-tail out of his trousers. The iodine spot on his back looked yellow and purple, and there were gasps from the crowd. He did it," Mark said, glaring accusingly at the little man. He tripped me and broke my back." Penelope was putting on a good act too, crying and wringing her hands and moaning. "My poor boy," she said over and over. A woman in the crowd came up and made a very expressive raspberry in the little man's face. The little man was not only bewildered, he was frightened. Mark judged the time had come. "Points for my broken back," he cried. Penelope held out a slip to the little man. He signed it dazedly, and he slipped out of the crowd while 3 men picked up Mark and laid him tenderly in Penelope's reclining wheelchair. Mark could hardly contain himself. As soon as they were safely out of sight, he said excitedly, "Let me see the slip." Penelope looked around. She kept pushing him, but she handed over the slip. 50,000 points, Mark read under his breath. "Isn't that wonderful?" He couldn't remember ever having felt so elated in his life. Penelope was shaking her head wonderingly. "That was a good act," she said. "I never felt the nerve to try that myself." "Oh, that's nothing." Mark was enthusiastic. "As soon as I get fitted up with a magnolite brace so it'll look good, I'm going to knock a piece out of that curbing. And then if I can find out who's the registered owner of it, I'll hit him for 25,000. Mark got the 25,000. The owner of the sidewalk was finally convinced that Mark's broken back was worth a lot. From then on, there was no holding Mark. Pretending to act for the little man who had originally knocked him down, he located the woman who had made a raspberry in the little man's face and collected another 2,000. The woman didn't recognize Mark because Mark's features were changed a little. Then Mark spotted 2 others who had made threatening noises and collected 500 from each, and from another who expressed doubt that he was really hurt. Mark got 1,000 points. There was nothing to it, really. Most people had regular beats, and all Mark had to do was sit at one side in Penelope's wheelchair and wait for them to come by. He would have collected more if he could have remembered more faces. He saw Connolly go by once a day, but now he wasn't afraid. He thought Connolly looked at him disappointedly. A couple of weeks later, he got his card back from the machine at Central and looked at it with great satisfaction. He had 113,000 points to his credit. He met Penelope, and they went to her apartment for dinner. Jubilantly, Mark got all the fancy food, even some synthetic meat, that he could get on his card, and they prepared for a feast. "The only thing is," Penelope said as she punched the dishes on the table, "I'm scared. I have a feeling you shouldn't have gone over 100,000.
Is that why you never cashed my slip for 35,000?
She nodded.
That's mostly the reason. My balance is over 80,000 and I was afraid.
Afraid of what?
I don't know, just afraid.
Well, said Mark, I'm not. I don't see what Central can do to a person for getting points. There's no rule against it.
It's dangerous, Penelope insisted.
Nevertheless, I have made a decision. 100,000 points, that's nothing. His head was high. I'm going after 1,000,000 points.
Penelope gasped.
Mark, you mustn't do anything like that. You have no use for 1,000,000 points.
No, Mark said complacently, but it's a lot of fun getting them, and it gives me something worthwhile to do. We'll sit up till 3 o'clock every morning and play bridge, and I'll stay in bed till noon and dream up new stunts. I'll pull one a week. Life is going to be worth living.
The announcing light showed at the door. Penelope pressed the admittance button. A tall man came in a moment later.
"Mark Renner?"
he asked. Mark jumped.
Conley!
Mark's stomach had a funny feeling in it.
"They told me I would find you here,"
Conley said. Penelope had recovered enough to gasp.
What do you want?
"I'm from Central Audit Bureau."
That's just lovely, Penelope said, but it doesn't mean anything to us but a place where we get our cards balanced.
"It should mean something to you," Conley said hollowly. "Central is the government."
Penelope stared at him.
Sit down, please. I thought Central was just a machine.
"It's something more than a machine. There's a small core of people who live inside the machine to service it, and occasionally adjust it. And those persons really are the government. That is, all the government we have."
He sat down stiffly, his back straight.
"Now then, Mr. Renner, your card today showed a credit balance of 113,000 points. Is that correct?"
Mark swallowed.
Yes?
He looked at Penelope. She was pale. With difficulty, Mark asked,
Is it your job to check up on people, to see if they are entitled to their points?
"Oh, my, no. Central doesn't care about that. In fact, Central doesn't care how much anybody's debit is. We figure as long as a man is in debt, we'll try to pay it off. They always do. At least. No, we never bother with debits, and I don't suppose we ever would."
Mark breathed a sigh of relief.
"But credit of over 100,000 is something else," said Conley. "The machines won't handle 6 figures without trouble, you see, so there has to be a penalty."
"Now then, I shall have to—" He looked very sad.
Wait,
cried Penelope.
His credit is 113,000, but I have his slip for 35,000. If I turned it in, that would fix it up for him, wouldn't it?
Mark felt a warm wave of gratitude toward Penelope. She was 1,000,000%, no question about it.
"Well, yes, I suppose so. We don't like these last-minute adjustments, but I suppose."
She came waving the slip and thrust it into Conley's face.
There, she said triumphantly. Put that on my account.
Conley looked a little sad.
"This is your slip?"
he asked Mark. Mark nodded gratefully.
"Let me have your credit card, Miss Penelope. Now then, I'll transfer these points."
Conley's eyes raised.
"Do you know what your balance is now, Miss Penelope?"
Penelope's mouth shut open and she popped a hand across it.
"You have now 122,000, Conley said.
He got up from his chair.
"Well, I'm sorry, folks. That's the way it is."
Mark gulped. What way?
"Miss Penelope will have to come with me."
Mark was on his feet.
If she goes, I go, he said dramatically.
Conley looked at him.
"If you feel that way about it, there won't be any trouble at all. You did go over, so I can take you in, too."
"In where?"
Penelope demanded.
"A certain number of persons is required to keep Central going, as I said, actually to be the government. But most of the population today is so apathetic they wouldn't be of any use at all. So years ago, some of us who were in Central got an idea. We discovered that whenever any citizen rebels against the monotony of life today, he or she eventually winds up trying to gather a lot of points because that is the only outlet for energy and ambition. That is the kind of person we need. So when anybody gets over 100,000, machine warns us. We go after them."
Conley picked up his Type N hat.
"Well, see you in the morning. Punch in your cards at window 1000. We'll do the rest. And by the way," he was at the door, "we start work at 8 o'clock.
Mark brightened.
Did you say work?
"Oh, it's only 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. The rest of your time is your own, only of course you can't come outside. It would upset things if the general public learned about us. Yes, it's a regular job. Not hard work, but steady work. Gives you something to aim for.
There are promotions, you know, and extra bonuses for those who show promise.
Work, Mark said. Steady work. You mean there'll be something to do all the time?
5 days a week, said Conley.
Mark said, This is so sudden. Why don't you sit down a minute while we let it soak in? We have plenty of enzymes and stuff for a guest, don't we, Miss Penelope? Why not stay for supper, Conley?
No, thanks, said Conley. We have beefsteak and hot biscuits for supper in Central.
Penelope shrieked with joy. Beef?
Mark was puzzled.
What's that?
It's an old-fashioned food, said Conley. Rather tasty, too.
Please sit down, Penelope begged, and tell us more.
Conley looked at his watch. Believe I will. My feet get a little tired all day from pounding the pavement. But there isn't much more to tell. You'll find out everything tomorrow, and I'm sure you'll like it. We try to give each person work to challenge him.
What if the person wouldn't want to go to Central?
Very few ever object. Once in a while they are afraid and run away, but we just register their number with all the machines. Whenever that number is presented for food or clothes, machines reject the card.
He paused.
A very neat arrangement. Of course, inside of Central, the point system as you now know it will be of no value whatever. We use money in Central.
Penelope had a can of synthetic meat in her hands. Beef, she said suddenly, and hurled the can into the disinstitute. I'm going to starve all night so I can enjoy eating tomorrow. So nobody ever gets away? Asked Mark.
Very seldom, though there's one fellow playing a game with Central. He must have gotten wind of us, and he keeps careful check on his points. About once every 3 months he starts going strong. We're putting in 8 or 10,000 points a day. Then his balance will shoot up over 100,000, and I'll go after him. But he's always just signed away a lot of points. Would you believe it? The last time he'd given away 50,000 points to a fellow who claimed a broken back. He said he knew it was a phony, but he had me there, and he laughed at me if he had signed away the points. The slip showed up next day.
Mark looked at Penelope and grinned. We should have known that nobody in his right mind would give away 50,000 points.
Conley raised his hand in a salute. See you tomorrow at Central. If they don't keep you busy, look me up.
Mark watched him leave. Then he looked beamingly at Penelope.
Work. Every day. 8 o'clock. We'll have to get up before breakfast. Isn't it wonderful?
But Penelope's bird-like eyes were bright.
He said there will be promotions and bonuses for those who show promise, she recalled. I wish we had known that. We could have made a clean-up and gone into Central with a record that would make their eyes pop out. Anyhow,
she dug her pad of release blanks out of her pocket and began to figure on the back. Let's see, 50,000 from the little man who's playing a game with Central, 25 from the owner of the sidewalk, 2,000 for the raspberry, 500 each from 2 who made noises of disrespect, and 1,000 from the man who doubled that your back was really broken. You could have collected 2,000 from that last one, she said absently, if you hadn't got cold feet. Anyway, that's 79,000 points. Now then, 20% of that is 15,800 points. She wrote rapidly and held out the pad to Mark. Sign my slip, please. End of Story 20. End of The Almighty Dollar in Space. Ed Reed Short Sci-Fi, Volume 6. Read by Edmund Bloxam.